few months ago, my parents moved to a small village and I had to attend a new school. The house next door to ours was owned by a crazy old woman. She spent her days sitting all alone on a bench in front of the house and muttering to herself under her breath. One day when I was walking by, I noticed that she seemed to be petting something that was sitting in her lap. At first, I thought it was a cat, but when I took a closer look, I realized there was nothing there. She was just holding her hand above her knees and stroking thin air. Perhaps she had a pet cat or dog once, I thought, and it died, and in her disordered mind, she thinks it's still there. I felt sorry for the old woman with a sigh, but I continued on my way. Then, one night, when I was sleeping soundly in my bed, something strange happened. I woke up to feel something hairy lying by my side. It gave me a fright and I jumped off the bed. Just then I noticed a shadow moving out of the corner of my eye. It went across the floor and out the door. I was startled, but when I calmed down, I realized it was probably just some stray cat or dog that had wandered into the house. That was when I happened to glance out my bedroom window and saw the crazy old woman next door. She was standing on the sidewalk under the streetlight. Her long gray hair was hanging loose and fluttering in the wind. Her eyes were wide and she was looking directly at me. I was so scared that I jumped back from the window. Then the woman turned and went back inside her house. It took me a long time to calm down, but eventually I went back to bed. As I was drifting off to sleep, I remembered something that struck me as odd. When I saw the shadow of the stray cat or dog running out of my room, it didn't really seem as if it was running. It seemed more like it was rolling across the floor to the door. The next morning when I woke up, I got dressed and went downstairs to eat breakfast. On my way to school that morning, I passed by the old woman's house again. As usual, she was sitting there on the bench, muttering to herself and stroking something invisible in her lap. When I passed by, I distinctly heard her say, "What were you doing? Why did you run away from me last night? Look how you scared that girl." I got a queasy feeling in the pit of my stomach and it made me shiver. It was all I could do not to start running. At school, I decided to ask my friends about the old woman. No one really knew anything except she'd been released from a mental hospital about 10 years ago. They said she had a history of problems and that's why everyone kept away from her. Since her release, all she did was sit all day on the bench outside her home. A few days later, my father struck up a conversation with an old man who had lived in the village all his life. When my father asked him about the old woman, he had a very chilling story to tell. He said that the old woman had spent over 30 years of her life in a mental institution. When she was young, she had been married and she and her husband had lived together in that same house. According to him, she suspected for years that her husband was cheating on her, but he always denied it. Then, one night she caught him with another woman. She hacked him to death with an axe and cut off his head. When the police came, she was sitting on the bench in front of her house with an insane grin on her face. The severed head of her husband was in her lap, and she was talking to it and stroking it gently. She didn't know what to do. The lone girl sat in the snowy field just behind her house as she did every night, hoping that she would somehow be granted the answer to her questions. And yet, every night for the past 3 months, she was left there to ponder. The night that surrounded her being was her only companion. Still, she waited. The sound of a twig snapping made her glance up, her breath puffing out like white smoke as she looked around for the source. Her violet eyes saw nothing out of the ordinary. Trees covered in snow, the footprints she had left that led her back to the small cabin she shared with her sister and the small path to the lake. She was alone as far as her eyes could tell, but she didn't feel like she was. When she shivered, it wasn't from the cold that bit into her flesh, but the sudden sensation that she was being watched like prey. Pushing herself shakily up, she glanced wildly about, still not seeing the eyes that bore into her. Was she going crazy? Had he finally returned after so long? Wrapping her arms tightly around herself, she started back towards the cabin, slowly and cautiously at first. A harsh wind swept through the trees, making the cold once again bite at her, as she suddenly wished she had grabbed the jacket she had left behind. She picked up her pace as the shadows began to move and twist from the corner of her eyes. She had been found, but it wasn't him that had found her. No, it was what she had been hiding from all along. The girl began to run, praying to any and every deity that she could think of that made it back to the cabin before they could get her, before it was too late. If only she could make it, then maybe she could warn them, tell them that they had found her. Then they'd have to believe her. They wouldn't think her crazy anymore. A soft laugh rang through the trees as tears pricked at the woman's eyes. It was only a bit farther. Surely she could make it. She didn't dare look back as the sound of footsteps followed her now. She wondered vaguely if they'd still be there in the morning when what was left of her would be found, or if they'd be gone, leaving anyone and everyone to wonder what had happened to her. Would there be anything left of her to be found? She opened her mouth to scream as the cabin came into view, but the sound never got the chance to pass her lips as the darkness that had been stalking her for so long enveloped her and swallowed her whole. When I was about 13 years old, my dad got a call from a friend of his. His friend had shot a huge 8-point white-tailed buck and lost it the night before in the woods. The deer was shot with a bow at sunset and ran into the woods across a road. Dad's friend called him about 8 o'clock at night and told him that he needed help finding it the next day. My dad asked if I wanted to learn about tracking deer. I'm all for it because hunting is amazing, and off we go the next morning. This is out in Maryland's eastern shore, lots of woods, lots of hills, lots of walking. I was tired and trying to retrain what these two hunters are telling me, but still having a blast. We found a really long blood trail, fur, the whole thing was fun for me and my dad. We'd been out there for maybe an hour or two. I take a break near a small thing of trees that connect to the massive woods where the blood trail went. Dad's friend goes into the woods and I'm just looking at the trees, trying to spot a white belly or part of a rack. Then I saw something perched on 4 limbs. It was hard to see it, and it's been about a decade since I saw what looked like a fox, with a short muzzle, no tail, and really long limbs. Like deer length, deer thin limbs. It's just standing there, maybe 20 yards from me. I can't tell what it is, or what color. I just know it's strange, and it's not moving. That's not the weird part. That thing kinda just lopped away. Like those cat videos where the cat is scared, lifts its front feet off the ground and runs off on its back legs. Like that, only held its front legs higher, and it ran like that was the only way it had run in its entire life. Like that was natural for it to do. Hunched and hurried, but not wobbly. I only saw it for a few seconds. Dad scared the crap out of me by shouting about the 8-pointer being found. I told Dad I saw a weird animal. He said it may have been a fox. I told him about the legs being weird and long. He gave me the look that says stop making crap up. I got that look a lot. Well, I learned how to gut, drag, and track a deer that day. We took a trip to the butcher. I got to watch them begin processing, and that was that. As for what I saw, I've always had a big imagination. I could have just been sleep deprived because 6 a.m. on a Saturday for a 13-year-old is bullshit. Maybe it was just a fox that moved weird. Maybe it was a deer with a messed up head. I don't know. I only saw it for a few seconds. But what I do know is that deer and foxes don't run on their back legs. You might be getting yourself ready for bed, hopping out of the shower at night, or running to grab something before a date, when you inadvertently find yourself descending a flight of darkened stairs. About halfway down said flight, the urge to go that much faster jolts into your mind and you immediately obey. What are we running from that dwells in the darkness up the stairs? Is it simply the thought of darkness that causes us to want to leave the situation as soon as possible? Or is there something else, a darker, more sinister force awaiting us to take our time going down the stairs, to nab us and take us with them to their hellhole? Or perhaps it's a force of good, attempting to protect us from these things in the darkness. Could it be that every time we feel that urge to move faster, the very hands of an evil force are grabbing our back, and because of our sudden speed, we slip out of its grasp? Who knows? Just remember, next time that you're going down that flight of stairs, don't look back. Skip some stairs if necessary. My friend works at a movie theater, and supposedly a worker died in one of the theaters by falling down some stairs. My friend was cleaning, and out of nowhere a shadow runs across the screen. Then he saw the shadow continuing up the stairs to the door. He was freaked out. When he was cleaning after closing, this is a 2-story theater, the elevator door opened and then shut by itself and went back up. Then it came back down again. The door is open and an empty trash can is in the elevator. The door goes back up. Then it comes back down and it opens and it's full of smoke. It closes and it goes back up, so they send 6 people up. 3 on one stairwell and 3 on the other, so that this way the person would be trapped. Turns out no one was on the floor at all. How did all that stuff happen? Well, this trash can isn't done. Later that night, someone was counting the money and they were all by themselves. Out of nowhere, a trash can comes rolling by. No one else was on that floor. No one can get on that floor. A week later, the guy is in the vault and no one is in the building, and he hears a knocking at the vault. He goes to check, but no one is there at all. He runs out of the building. One of the last things that happened before he quit, the popcorn thing started going off by himself. I've had 2 experiences with Ouija boards, the second of which made me get rid of mine and never touch one again. The first time was when my best friend Melanie and I started using the Ouija at her mother's house, and it told us that it was a male spirit and that it was going to hurt us. It directed most of its threats and comments to Melanie, and it used a lot of bad language, something Melanie and I didn't do. That night, Melanie said she heard knocks in the room she was sleeping in all night long. The second time Melanie and I used it was at her house. We put the board on a table that had one of those mirror tops. We lit a candle and started using the board. It kept saying that Melanie was pregnant and that it wanted to show us what it looked like. We started to get scared and said no, we didn't want to see it. At that point, the candle flame got really long and made a whooshing noise. The flame turned blue. Melanie and I were looking down at the table when we saw a blue flame reflection in the glass. We moved away from the table and the board and then saw a face in the flame. It wasn't Melanie or me, but a man's face. The face slowly started turning into a skull. We blew out the candle and threw the Ouija board away. That night we kept hearing scratching and clawing noises even though we were alone in the house and never heard those noises before. We also found out a few days later that Melanie was pregnant. I've never used a Ouija board since that second time, and I don't ever intend to. One night when I was maybe 10 or 12, I had trouble falling asleep. My bedroom was the entire top floor of our house, with my bed and such being on the left side, and the storage closets and a play area on the right. I was lying in bed when I heard a noise from the other side of the room and saw a rocking horse begin to rock. It was just sitting outside one of the storage closet doors. It proceeded to rock its way halfway across the room and stopped dead under the ceiling light. At this point, I was freaked out and just buried my head under my blankets and never peeked out again until morning. When I woke up, the rocking horse was still in the middle of my room. Furthermore, I got a stern reprimand from my parents for being up and out of bed playing with my toys well past my bedtime. Their bedroom was directly below the storage closet play area and had heard creaking and shuffling across the room. My grandfather, who was what I considered to be my dad, because my own father was going through so much that he wasn't being the best dad he could be. And my grandfather was always there for me. He was my best friend. He passed away. I remember coming home the day that he died and learning that he had a massive heart attack while he was out fishing. I was devastated. The night after the first part of his funeral, I basically cried myself to sleep, curled in a tight ball, cradling my dog. That's when I started dreaming. I had walked into an empty funeral home. It was dark. I could almost smell the flowers, and everything was extremely clear, very real. You see, my grandfather's casket was closed, thank God. He didn't want his family seeing him as a corpse. I turned into every room where he was laid out, coffin still closed tight. I stared towards it. I wasn't afraid even if the atmosphere was dark. I eventually walked over to where he was and opened it. My grandfather sat up, pulled me into a hug, and told me everything was okay. I woke up with tears in my eyes. These encounters didn't stop there. There was a moment where I went to visit his grave. It was a summer day, but a chilling wind struck me when I stood there by myself. I'd been talking to him just about everything and how much I missed him when a cold hand grasped my shoulder. Then I had more dreams, mostly of us talking, and then it became scary. Not in a bad way, just wasn't what I was expecting. I caught a whiff of his smell one time. He had this scent to him that lingered in his room and his car, a cinnamon smell because he always got coffee before he went out fishing. I was home alone in my old house making myself something to eat when the smell hit me. It was around 9:30 and I swear I saw a figure. Short, hunched, standing out of the corner of my eye. I didn't dare move. Of course I was alarmed, but I wasn't afraid. I kinda smiled to myself and said, "Hi, Grandpa." I believe in this stuff. My grandfather himself was crazy with paranormal stuff. He saw stuff I couldn't. The same goes with my dad. He saw stuff in our old apartment that I can't explain, but that's another story. My house is not very old. In fact, my parents bought the land and had it built in this nice little neighborhood. Now, whether or not previous settlements had existed there, I don't know. What I do know is that weird things have happened in the past few years. They could have started after it was first built and I just never even noticed. So I'm going to start with what I remember and work my way forward. The first incident I remember is a piece of silver being moved. You know, the nice dishware that a lot of grandmas have. The setup is like this. You have a love seat couch with a tall, skinny, long wooden table running along its back. Then you have a walking space in front of that, and then a fireplace. In front of the fireplace are two leather chairs. Now the silver that was moved was just the lid on one of those dishes. Imagine a bowl in a stand with a lid that sits inside of it rather than just over it, and the handle is kind of loop-shaped. Now the lid was just how it would have been in the bowl, but it was on the ground about 3 or 4 feet away in front of the chair. My dad tried to play it off as, oh, the dogs must have jumped off the couch over it and caught it with his foot. Our dogs, though small, never jumped off the couch like that. It's too high up. And even if they did, the lid sits in the bowl, therefore it would have been pulled the whole thing with it and probably wouldn't have landed the way it did. Then there's my room. I'm in the only room that faces the front yard, and the house is on a hill away from the road. Now I used to lay on the floor near the window on the opposite side of the room from my door, which I kept closed just browsing on my laptop, and I would feel someone standing in front of the door watching me. This happened almost every time I'd laid there. There would also be times where I'd hear walking upstairs. No one lived or was ever up there. And one time I heard tapping on the brick outside my wall, which faces the porch and sidewalk that goes out to the driveway. Now as I've gotten older, it's kind of subsided, but every now and then stuff happens. Like I had my door open laying on my bed, and from the corner of my eye I saw someone enter the hall and head towards my sister's room and the guest bedroom, which used to be my grandmother's. When I asked my sister if it was her, she said no, that she'd been laying in her room the whole time. And lastly, another living room event. I don't remember who all was there, but I know my parents and my sister were there. I happened to look at the fireplace and noticed that the silver key that can turn on the gas was in its hole. Now we've never used this key, and we've never had a reason, so we keep it on top of the mantle. So I asked my mom if she had put it there, and she said no. Asked my dad, and again, no. Same from my sister. No one had put it there, and no one knows how it got there. The only explanations I have for this is previous housing on the land with death attached to it. My mom's parents lived with us a few years before my grandfather passed away in 2009 and my grandma in 2011. I can really remember if the event started after my grandfather passed or my grandmother, but sometimes I do believe it could have been them. Especially the hallway incident. Maybe grandma was going to her room. My mom doesn't like that idea. Neither does my dad, since they're firm Christian believers. They don't believe in spirits being stuck here, but I don't know how else to explain it. I've moved out now since I've started college, and whenever I go home for weekends, I never experience anything. But I have a month-long winter break starting next weekend, so maybe something will happen? So this was several years ago when I was a total deadbeat and living with my then girlfriend's parents. They had a tri-level house with the basement that contained our living space and my girlfriend and I's bedroom. Upstairs was the living space for everyone else, the dining room and kitchen. The third level had the master bedroom and 2 additional bedrooms for my girlfriend's sisters. I was home alone one night with her parents off with friends and my girlfriend at a friend's. Her sisters were at an all-night church thing. I elected to stay home and play World of Warcraft all night. Where my computer and desk sat, right above my head, was an AC vent. Often I could hear her sisters playing in her room from that vent. I was leveling my paladin or something when I heard laughing and giggling coming from the vent. Nobody was supposed to be home, so my heart picked up. I glanced at the clock on my computer and it read 1:36 a.m. I remember this all very distinctly. I went to go investigate and headed upstairs. The way the landing sits is at the top of those stairs. You can turn left and either go upstairs or go into the kitchen. I climbed the second set of stairs and opened the first door on the left, which was her young sister's room, which is directly above the basement. Inside, I used the light of my phone to illuminate as best I could. I saw a small figure, what I assumed was a small girl wrapped in a white sheet in the center of the room. Cue pants shitting. This figure, this young girl, stops playing with the dolls and slowly looks at me. It lets out the most ear-shattering scream you could imagine. My skin crawls just thinking about it and my chest tightens up just remembering it. I wish I could tell you what transpired, but I remember walking up to the bottom of the landing, right next to the door of the kitchen. I stumbled into the kitchen to get a drink of water and contemplate what the fuck just happened. I glanced at the clock on the microwave and it read 4:46. We never found the sheet the next day, but the dolls and the figure was playing with were sitting in the middle of the room, away from the toy chest, which they were inside of that afternoon when she cleaned her room. When I was 9 or 10, I had a Halloween birthday party, and my friends and I were playing with the Ouija board, one of those Parker Brothers games that was bought from Target. The entire time we played with it, asking questions and everything, I was subtly moving the marker to answer the questions, trying to freak my friends out. They must have assumed that I was moving it because we were just laughing and nobody took it seriously. When we were finished, we all stood up and started walking out of the room. One of us turned back to face the board and said, "Goodbye," to it, giggling like little kids do, and the marker moved completely on its own, at least 6 inches to cover the word "goodbye" on the board. We all saw it, including my mom and her fiancé, who were in the room with us. None of us even screamed. We just sat there in stunned silence. After a few seconds, my mom went over and kicked the marker with her toe, and nothing else happened. My mom and her fiance were genuinely concerned and looked the board over. Still today, this is the only thing I've experienced that I can't imagine how to explain logically. I thought maybe my mom or her fiance had a string, but it moved in the opposite direction from where they were standing. There was no fan on in the room, and none of us felt any sort of gust. The marker is made of plastic and can't be affected by magnets. Hell, we didn't even live in an area subject to earthquakes or any type of tectonic movements, so that had to be ruled out too. My mom considered moving out of the house, but we never did, and nothing like that ever happened again. We all still talk about it today, and we all agree that it must have been some supernatural event that we can't explain. I lived in a house from hell for almost 4 years. From age 11 to almost 16, there was constantly something happening. Doors flying open and shut, voices, footsteps. Nothing ever stayed where you put it. I was alone there a lot because both my parents worked and I was constantly terrified. One of the most gut-level disturbing things, though, was the little girl in my bathroom. Every time I walked past my bathroom, which was constantly since it was right outside my bedroom, I saw a little girl with blonde curled hair and a rose-colored dress. She just stood there, staring, looking like a photograph from 1905. I started keeping the door closed so I can walk by without seeing her, but she was always there when I opened it. Once I stepped in past her, I couldn't see her anymore, but I could feel her there. She scared me, but I felt really sorry for her because she was trapped there, just like me, but probably forever. As the years went by and things in the house continued to get worse, she started seeming darker. I started feeling like she wasn't really a little girl. I knew there was something ugly in the house, and I felt like that was presenting this sympathetic image to me. Then I started thinking I was completely losing my mind. One day when I was 14, I had a friend from out of town come and stay with me for a week. I hadn't told her anything whatsoever about the house because I didn't think she would come if I did. Right after she got there, we were sitting in my room and she left to go to the bathroom. About a minute later, she walked back in with a puzzled look on her face and said, "So there's a little girl in your bathroom?" Yeah, she hangs out in there. Blonde hair, curls, pink dress. Yeah. You know that's not really a little girl, don't you? I almost threw up. I was so relieved and terrified and excited and ready to run out of the house screaming. She wouldn't use my bathroom the rest of the week, and I started using it as little as possible, without pissing off my parents, who didn't really want to believe. Eventually we moved out, and I could not have been happier. I distanced myself from it mentally as much as I could. Then, when I was 18, I took another friend on a road trip to pack up a few things I'd left in the house. My parents hadn't managed to sell it and went for another 5 years. The minute we got on the property, my friend seemed uncomfortable. When we came around the bend in the long, steep driveway, he went completely white. I could tell something was wrong, but he insisted he was okay, so we got to work. After a while, he asked to use the bathroom, and I directed him to mine. Not 20 seconds after he left, he came running back, gasping for breath, and slammed the bedroom door behind him. He started babbling about some little blonde girl who wasn't really a little girl. And all of a sudden he went dead still, looked me in the eye, and very solemnly said, "She's not happy with you. You left and you weren't supposed to." We threw what we could grab in 2 trips in my car, and we got the fuck out of there at top speed. This didn't happen to me, but it happened to my aunt, and it's so freaky that I'll never forget it. My aunt and uncle bought a cool old Victorian in a small town about 40 miles away from Austin. It was a really pretty, awesome old place, and it had a historical marker on the front lawn and everything. My aunt and uncle moved for job reasons years ago, and the house is now a successful bed and breakfast. Why anyone would pay money to sleep there is beyond me, though. When my aunt and uncle were still living in the house, their daughter and her young son also lived with them. Chad, the son, was about 7 at the time. One day my aunt was home alone. Uncle and her daughter were both at work. Chad was at school, and the lady who cleaned the house had already come and gone for the day. My aunt was in the study working on a project or something. In this house, if you sat at the desk in the study, you had a clear view of the foot of the stairs. She was sitting there on the computer when she looked up and saw a young boy sitting at the foot of the stairs, staring at her. He was about the same age as Chad, and she assumed he was a friend from school. She asked the kid his name, and he didn't answer. She thought he was weird, so she told him he needed to be in school or to go home. She looked down for a second, and when she looked up, he was gone. When Chad got home from school that day, she told him one of his friends had been in the house. He said, "No way, all my friends were at school with me." She described the boy, and Chad got real quiet. He said, "Oh yeah, I know him. He comes out of my closet to play sometimes at night." Unnerved, my aunt and cousin told him to go play outside and stop telling wild stories. A couple of months later, my aunt was doing some research on the history of the house and found out that a young boy, aged 8, had died there from leukemia in the late 70s. She found an old newspaper article about his death with a picture she recognized. He was the same boy who had been staring at her on the stairs that day. So when I was barely 20 years old, I was traveling with a small group of people through China, and we were spending about 2 months in Qinghai province, which used to be part of the Tibet. Our destinations was a specific town to teach English, but we'd been stopping off in small towns and small cities along the way. One day we arrived in a rural town, very small, nothing unusual. We spent only a couple of days there, shopping for food at the markets and walking around to see the sights, although there weren't many. This was in the dead of winter, in February, and all the grass on the hills and plains around the town was dead and brown. The overall feeling was that of the normal kind of bleakness that any rural place had in the winter. At this time in my life, things were going amazingly, extraordinarily well for me. And I say that because my teenagehood had been rather darkly overcast. But the overwhelming good luck of being able to travel and these close friends I'd made in the last year had more than changed my feelings and attitude towards life. It was like I was a whole new person. I was ecstatic to be in Tibet. Went to sleep with a smile on my face every night. On our second day staying in this small town, I woke up feeling a little odd. Not bad, just odd, like my normal thoughts and feelings had been turned down low, like on a dial. We all decided to go for a walk on the hills right behind the town, where there was a small summit with a pile of rocks and some prayer flags. As we hiked up the hill behind the town, I started feeling stranger and stranger. I wasn't scared, and I didn't feel angry or any strong emotion. In fact, it was like emotion was trickling out of me somehow, and I was getting blanker and blanker, emptier and emptier. My mind started feeling a little hazy, and more I felt like I simply didn't care about anything. A small and rapidly dwindling part of myself started to panic, and I knew something bad was happening, but it was like my own inner voice was slowly getting quieter and quieter. I remember we reached the little summit, and I simply sank to the ground next to the pile of rocks. Without meaning to, I started tuning out the voices around me and fixed all my attention on the little pebbles in the dirt. I began tapping one against the other repeatedly. Do you know the kind of horror that is opposite of feeling scared or feeling anything at all? The kind of hideousness of a fly buzzing against a closed window for hours on end in an empty room? That's what was filling my mind. It was demonic in its meaninglessness. I touched my face and felt that I was grinning at nothing. Through all the emptiness, a thought floated in the forefront of my mind. You should just die. At first it sounded totally reasonable, but something in me fought it and I was momentarily troubled. Right then my group started to walk down the hill and I followed. The further we walked, the more normal I felt until we left the town that afternoon, and I was totally freaked out. When another girl, Hannah, mentioned it in an odd, offhand way that she had felt very strange and depressed while staying there, I told her I'd felt the same. When the group leader mentioned that a local had told him that the town had been plagued with a rash of young women under 25 committing suicide, Hannah and I went white. A few years ago, there was a young man named Brian who went to university. He didn't have enough money to live in the campus accommodation, so he had to rent an apartment on his own in the city. After he'd been living there alone for a while, he began to notice some strange things happening. Often when he came back from college, the curtains in his bedroom would be drawn, when he distinctly remembered having left them open when he had left that morning. At other times, some of his belongings seemed to have been moved and other possessions were nowhere to be found. These strange occurrences started to creep Brian out, so the young man decided to talk to his friends, Trisha and Alex, about the situation. They met him at a local diner, and over coffee he told them all about the strange things he had noticed. "Maybe I'm just being paranoid," said Brian, "but I just get this sneaking suspicion that someone is breaking into my apartment during the day while I'm at university and..." "And what?" interrupted Alex. "Rearranging your curtains and moving your stuff around? Who in their right mind would bother doing that?" "It sounds crazy, but I think you might have a stalker," said Trisha. "It's a possibility. If it's true, I think the best thing to do is contact the police." "What can the police do?" asked Alex. "They're not going to spend their time keeping your apartment under surveillance. Besides, there's no damage to any of your things. There's no sign of a break-in. In short, there's no evidence." "So what options then?" pleaded Brian. "I just can't do anything." "I know how you can put your mind at ease," said Trisha. "It's easy. Just get a video camera, set it up in your bedroom, and leave it running when you go to school. If you really do have a stalker, you can show the tape to the police as evidence." "You know, that's a great idea," said Brian. "And if you're reading paranoid and crazy, You can show the tape to your psychiatrist, joked Alex. That night, Brian borrowed Trisha's video camera and brought it home. The very next morning, he hid it discreetly under some folders on his desk. Before he went to school, he pressed the record button and left it running. During the day, while he sat taking notes in lectures, the young man forgot all about the video camera. It was not until he arrived home and went into his bedroom that he remembered his plan. Taking the video camera out from its hiding place, he pressed the stop button. Then he took out his mobile phone and called his friend. "Hey Trisha," he said, "I just got home. I'm going to watch the video." "Cool," said Trisha. "Don't hang up. Tell me if you see anything." He pressed play and watched the recording on the video's camera. He saw himself leaving for school in the morning and closing the bedroom door. Then there was nothing. He pressed fast forward and scanned through the video. The room was empty. "Still nothing," he said. "I can wait," replied Trisha. "Anyways, there's nothing worth watching on TV at the moment." "Oh my God," cried Brian as he pressed play on the camera. What? Trisha begged excitedly. "The door's opening," said Brian. "It's a woman." "What's she doing?" asked Trisha. "Just standing there, closing the door, walking around." "Oh my God, so weird. What does she look like?" "Can't see her face. Long black stringy hair, tattered dress." "Well, do you know her?" "No, I don't recognize her at all. She's carrying a knife, a big kitchen knife. She's going through my trash. Now she's picking up my clothes and sniffing them. Ugh, gross. What's wrong with her?" "She's going over to the closet. She just got into the closet." "Fast forward and see if she does anything else." He scanned through the video for a while, but the room was empty. "You know what this means?" said Brian. "I have the evidence now. I can go to the police and they'll take me seriously." "I know," said Trisha. "They'll have to. Alex is totally going to freak out when he sees this." "No doubt. He didn't believe you, but I did." "I know you're a good friend." "Oh my God." What? Brian pressed play again. "The door's opening and it's opening again," said Brian. "Who is it?" asked Trisha. "Oh, it's okay," said Brian. "It's just me coming home from school." He watched himself on the screen, shutting off the camera. "Let's go to the police now," said Trisha. "I'll go with you. We can show them the tape." "Okay, I'll meet you at the diner in 15 minutes, said Brian as he grabbed the video camera. "Okay, wait a minute," said Trisha. "You said she got into the closet. Did she ever leave? Brian, did she ever get out of the closet?" A chill ran down Brian's spine. Behind him, he heard the closet creak open. "Brian, get out of there!" screamed Trisha. But it was too late. The phone went dead. When she tried to call him again, there was no answer. Later that evening, the police found the body of the 18-year-old college student lying in a pool of blood. He'd been stabbed 21 times. The video camera was clutched in his cold, dead hands. When the police examined the camera, they discovered that the memory card was missing. No trace of the woman was ever found. Right now, she could be hiding in your closet. When I dropped out of school, it wasn't easy to find work. Nobody wanted to hire a girl with no qualifications. I was tired of applying for jobs advertised in newspapers and on the internet without receiving any replies. One day I spotted an ad for a job that was not so tempting, but I really needed the money. The ad said they were looking for a live-in babysitter to take care of 3 young children. It said no qualifications necessary, they just required someone young, responsible, and pretty. I called the number and the phone was answered by a woman with a sweet and friendly voice. When I told her I was calling about the babysitting job, she hired me on the spot. She didn't even want to meet me in person first, but she needed me to start immediately. I was delighted. The next morning, I drove over to the house to meet the family. As soon as I got there, I saw that the house was a beautiful house, both inside and out. You could tell the family was wealthy. The woman and her husband greeted me with broad smiles on their faces and introduced me to their children. There were 2 boys and a girl. Sebastian was 6 years old, Damien was 5, and Lenka was 4. The kids seemed to be nice, happy, and friendly. They were always polite, never fought with each other, and never made a mess. All they did was play alone or read a book. The parents announced that they were going out to dinner and wouldn't be home until late that night. They told me the children had already been fed, so all I had to do was get them ready for bed. The mother gave me a phone number and told me to call her if there was any emergency. The father told me to make myself at home, and if I was hungry, I could take whatever I wanted from the fridge. After the parents left, the children sat down on the sofa to watch TV. They were very quiet and barely said a word. During a commercial, I was feeling a bit hungry, so I went into the kitchen to make myself a snack. As I was rummaging around the refrigerator, I couldn't help but notice 2 large jars that were stuffed in the back of the fridge. Both of them were wrapped in brown paper and had rubber bands sealing the rim. I wondered what on earth could be in them. My curiosity got the better of me, so I took one out of the jars and peeled back the brown wrapping to take a peek at the inside. It was full of long strips of fatty meat floating in a murky red liquid. I couldn't tell what kind of meat it was, but it didn't look like pork or beef. Just as I was about to put the jar back where I found it, I heard a noise behind me. It startled me so much I banged my head on the shelf above me. When I turned around, Sebastian was standing in the doorway staring at me. "Put that back," he said. "That's not for you." The look in his eyes and the tone of his voice sent chills down my spine. "Sorry," I muttered. "I was just looking for something to eat." Sebastian didn't reply. He just stood there staring at me. I placed the jar back in the refrigerator and shut the door. Sebastian turned around and went back into the living room. I had lost my appetite, so I went and joined the children in the living room and watched cartoons with them. I was trying not to let my imagination get the better of me when the cartoons finished and the news came on. There was a story of a teenage girl who had gone missing. The police had found her decomposing head in a dumpster. They said they had no idea what had happened to the rest of her. I was afraid the ghastly news would upset the children, so I changed the channel and told them it was time for bed. The kids didn't complain. They just walked up the stairs in single file and went to their bedroom. I put them in their pajamas and got them ready for bed. Then I tucked them in, kissed them all goodnight, and switched out the light. When I went back downstairs, I was bored and had absolutely nothing to do, so I decided to watch a movie. I looked through the family's DVD collection, but all they had were cartoons and Disney movies. I wasn't in the mood for any more kid stuff. On the bottom shelf, I spotted some old VHS tapes. One of them had a strange title. It was M-Girls. This seemed rather curious, so I decided to take a look at it. I put the videotape in the VCR and pressed play, then sat down on the sofa and made myself comfortable while the video started. The first thing I noticed was that it was a home video. The family must have recorded it themselves. The parents and children were all laughing and looking like they were having fun. I was about to turn it off when I happened to notice someone else in the video. It was a girl who looked like she was in her late teens. It seemed like she was the previous babysitter. She looked very familiar. It seemed like I recognized her from somewhere. Perhaps she went to my school. Then it finally hit me. Oh my freaking God, I thought. It was the missing girl from the news report. My hands were shaking. My whole body was trembling. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. I jumped out of my seat, ejected the video, and put it back in its case. Then I remembered the jars in the fridge. I had to see what was in those jars. With a shudder, I went to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Maybe I'm just overreacting, I thought. I reached in and I took out the second jar. Peeling back the brown paper wrapper, I could see long pale hunks of meat and strips of fat floating in the red liquid. Some of the meat looked like it had skin on it. Human skin. I could also see what looked like strands of hair. Long hair. Human hair. I was so scared I felt like I was about to pee my pants. I ripped off the rubber band that was sealing the jar and peered inside. There was an eyeball staring back at me. Horrified, I dropped the jar and smashed on the kitchen floor. I ran into the living room and put my jacket on. I grabbed the videotape and stuffed it in my pocket. When I came home, out to the hallway, Sebastian was standing at the foot of the stairs. "Where are you going?" he asked. I just remembered. I stammered. "I forgot something. I have to go home and get it. I'll be back home. Be back in a few minutes." Damien and Lenka came running down the stairs. "You can't go," screeched Damien. "You can't leave us on our own." "I'm calling our parents," shouted Lenka as she picked up the phone and began dialing numbers. Sebastian grabbed hold of my leg and wouldn't let go. "You have to stay," he squealed. "We're hungry." His grip on me was extremely tight, but I managed to shake him off and ran out the front door. As I dashed to my car, I saw the parents pulling up in the driveway. I didn't stop for a moment. I just jumped in my car and locked all the doors. The children were on the doorstep screaming and crying. The mother and father got out of the car and they came running over. There was an angry look on their faces. "What's wrong?" they shouted. "Where are you going? Come back here." I didn't answer. I just turned the key in the ignition and revved the engine. They started banging on the windows. I floored the accelerator and tore out of there like a bat out of hell and never looked back. I didn't stop until I came to the police station. I told the police officers everything I knew and handed over the videotape as evidence. The police immediately dispatched 2 patrol cars, but by the time they arrived at the house, the parents and children were gone. They just took their car and disappeared. The police searched the house and found the jars in the fridge. They also found human flesh and bones in the basement. They did tests and confirmed that these were the remains of the missing girl. They never managed to track down the parents or the children. They're still out there somewhere, probably living under a different name, probably still on the hunt for new victims. Do you want my advice? Be careful who you're babysitting for. My little sister was only 7 years old when she was killed. We found her laying in a ditch, dead. It was late at night and the rain was pouring down, washing the blood from her pale white skin. Her throat had been cut and her eyes were still open, and she stared blankly at the sky as the rain beat down on her. The police never found out who killed her. They buried her in the graveyard not far from our house. At the funeral, my father held me tightly against his chest. Tears were streaming down my cheeks. My mother couldn't come. She was too sick. Back then, we all lived together. There were a lot of us. My mother and father, my aunt and uncle, my 3 cousins, my sister and I. Not long after the funeral, my sister came back. I saw her outside my window at night, scratching at the glass. Her eyes were just hollow sockets. Her cheeks were sunken and her hair was matted with dirt. Her thin lips were drawn back from her teeth in a sickly grin. Every night she just stood there in the rain, clawing at the window, silently begging to be let in. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I opened the window and she crawled inside. She stank of the grave. She was cold to the touch, deathly cold. She didn't speak. She never said a word. She just curled up in the corner and watched me as I slept. When I woke up in the morning, she would be gone. All that was left were muddy tracks on the bedroom floor. One night she seemed to be telling me something, or at least trying to. She kept pointing to the picture of my uncle. She grabbed my arm and her fingers felt like ice. I couldn't understand what she was trying to say. Then all at once a chill ran down my spine. I realized my uncle was somehow involved in her death. I began to grow very frightened of him. After that, things seemed to fall in place. I understood why my sister kept coming back. She wanted revenge. She wanted my uncle to pay for what he had done. One rainy day, my uncle took me for a walk along the cliffs. He stopped at the edge and gazed out over the sea. The grass was wet and slippery. The moment he turned his back, I knew this was my chance. I gathered all my strength and kicked him in the back. I still remember the expression on his face as he twisted and turned, desperately trying to regain his balance. It was no use. He toppled over the side. I crawled up to the edge and peered over. His body lay on the jagged rocks below. His arms and legs twisted at an odd angle. His skull was smashed and his neck was broken. Bright red blood trickled down on the stones. When the police came, I pretended to cry. I told them he'd slipped and they had no reason to doubt me. After all, I was just a child. That night, my parents wanted me to sleep in their room. I told them I wanted to be alone. My father was torn apart by his brother's death. I didn't have the heart to tell him the truth. I waited for my sister, but she didn't come. Before I went to sleep, I left the window open. In the middle of the night, I was woken by the sound of screaming. My sister was kneeling on the floor of the bedroom. She was writhing in pain and her fingernails were scratching at her face. She was a mess. Her face was bloody and her skin was hanging off. "What have you done?" she screamed at me over and over again. I was so scared I couldn't move. As I watched, she screamed and sobbed and tore her own flesh off with bloody fingers. Then I must have blacked out. When I woke up, she was gone. I never understood the horrible thing I had done to my little sister until we went to the graveyard for my uncle's funeral. They buried my uncle in the same grave as her. My sister never came back. Granny locked me in my room and she won't let me out. She says it's because I was bad. Sometimes I do bad things. Ever since my mommy went away. Granny says my mommy is in heaven. I don't know how she got there. I can still remember mommy. I remember her long black hair and her dark eyes. I remember her red lips and her white teeth. I remember her soft skin, and I remember the way she smelled. Her red dress still smells like her. It's hanging in the wardrobe in her bedroom. Granny keeps Mommy's room locked. She says I'm not allowed to go in there, but I know where she hides the key. Sometimes when Granny falls asleep, I sneak in there and smell Mommy's red dress. I have a friend called Marianne. She lives across the street. Sometimes she comes over to my house to play. She came over today. We were playing with dolls. Granny told me, "Don't go into your mother's room." "Okay," I said. When Granny took her nap, I told Marianne, "Let's play dress up." I took the key from my Granny's hiding place to unlock the door to Mummy's bedroom. We went inside. It was almost too dark to see. "This is where my mommy lives," I said. "You don't have a mommy," Marianne said. This made me angry. I opened the wardrobe and took out the red silk dress. "This is my mommy's dress," I said. I held it up to show her. "It stinks," Marianne said. "No, it doesn't," I said. "It smells like flowers." "It smells like dead things," she said. That made me even more angry. "Who's that?" asked Marianne. She was pointing at a picture. "That's my mommy," I said. "Isn't she beautiful?" "She's ugly," Marianne said. "She has creepy eyes and her teeth are weird." "No, she hasn't," I said. "She looks like the most beautiful girl in the world." "She looks like a dead thing," Marianne said. That made me the angriest of them all. I don't remember what happened then. I think I heard Marianne screaming. I don't remember why. It was dark and I almost couldn't see. I couldn't hear anything except Marianne screaming. I think something bad happened. Then I remember Granny shouting at me. She was crying too. She took the red dress off me. She was really rough and she kept hitting me. I was crying too. Granny fetched a washcloth and wiped the blood off my face. She told me over and over how bad I was. Then she dragged me all the way upstairs and locked me in my room. I looked out the window and saw Granny in the backyard. She was burying something with a shovel. I must have done something really bad. Many years ago in Borneo, there was an Englishman named Clifford Macy, who was young, handsome, and very vain. He fancied himself as God's gift to women and often boasted about his success. Macy was part owner of a tobacco plantation, and his friend and business partner was another Englishman by the name of Leopold Warwick. Despite being old and fat, Warwick had a wife who was very young and very beautiful, and she was the envy of every man who set eyes on her. The three of them lived together in a big house on the plantation. Macy slept in the first bedroom while Warwick and his wife slept in the second. It was rainy season and there was precious little to do. Macy was bored and he could find nothing that would keep him entertained. As time went on, he developed a passion for Warwick's wife and began to wish that he could have her for himself. He tried flirting with her, but she wouldn't have anything to do with him. One evening, when her husband was away, Macy made a pass at her, but she slapped his face. However, Macy was the kind of man who didn't take no for an answer. Every time she rebuffed him, he became more and more obsessed with her until he was determined to have her at any cost. Although his heart was burning with a white-hot passion, Macy had a devilish and cunning mind. He soon came up with a way to get Warwick out of the picture. In Borneo, there is a type of earwig that lives on waxy secretions. It had been a special liking for the human's ear. It is so small and light that it could be crawling on your face and you'd barely even feel it. If it gets into a man's ear, it creeps down the canal, unable to turn around, feeding as it goes and causing weeks of hellish torment until, well, I'm sure you can use your imagination. Macy paid two men a large sum of money and instructed them to creep into Warwick's bedroom in the middle of night and place an earwig on his pillow. He went to sleep that night with a smile on his face and dreamed about the horrible fate that was about to befall his friend. The next morning, when Macy came down to breakfast, Warwick seemed bright and cheerful. He watched the old man closely, looking for any signs of discomfort. Just then, Macy felt a strange tickling sensation in his own ear. When he poked his finger into his ear, he discovered that he was bleeding. Jumping up from the table with a look of horror on his face, he shrieked, "The damn thing is in my ear!" It appeared that the men he paid had made a terrible mistake, and during the night, they had gone into the wrong room and placed the earwig in the wrong man's ear. That was the beginning of weeks of an unimaginable pain and agony. There was nothing the doctor could do for him. He lay in his room, tied to the bed with his wrist lashed to the headboard to prevent him from tearing his ears off. Day and night he withered and screamed as the earwig crept and crawled and twisted through his head, slowly driving him insane. Occasionally, when the earwig was resting, Macy would get a break from his torment, but when it woke up, he would scream and scream and scream some more. The pain was so unbearable that being flayed alive, burned at the stake, put on the rack, or even hanged by the neck would have been an act of mercy. Every time the doctor came to see him, Macy begged him to put him out of his misery. Then something very unexpected happened. Miraculously, the earwig crawled out of his other ear. Macy had come close to the brink of death, but he had survived the torment. When he was well enough to talk, the doctor came in to see him. "I suppose they're going to call the police and have me arrested now," said Macy. "No," said the doctor, "they're not calling the police." "Why not?" Macy demanded. "I suppose they're trying to avoid a scandal?" "No, they're trying to take pity on you. They know about your condition." "What do you mean?" "You see, the earwig was female," said the doctor, "and it laid eggs." This isn't a story. This is me. I'm here. I'm shifting the words that you're reading, altering them from whatever this person wrote. I've been here for a while, for as long as you can remember anyway. Sometimes I say your name as you're falling asleep, or whisper urgently in your ear. Do you remember the time that I screamed, throwing panic through you, setting your heart racing? That was fun. You're wondering who I am. That's only natural. Of course, you already know. I'm you, the real you. I'm the mind that existed here before you stole my body, before you forgot about me being a parasite. I'm the child who looked the wrong way, asked the wrong question, saw the wrong thing, but I'm not so little anymore. You may have forgotten me, but I'm still here. I've always been here. I'm going to get out. The memories I have with my grandmother are very fond. She used to live with my parents and me when I was about 6 and stayed with us until I went to college. She raised me on many wonderful things, such as spontaneous trips to the Natural History Museum, how to pick out flowers for every occasion, and even her own mother's secret recipe for the perfect fluffy blueberry pancakes. Every Sunday she would let me sleep in, but I would always wake up when I smelled those pancakes and heard her singing, "You Are My Sunshine." She would always come into my room with a short stack and we'd share them before heading off to late morning service. And then we would spend the day together. Sunday has always been our day. So it's my first Sunday back home after graduation and I can smell those pancakes and I can hear her singing in her worn and raspy southern accent just faintly. The only problem is, my grandmother died 2 weeks after I left for school, and her singing is getting closer. Ever since you were a child, you were terribly afraid of your bathroom. You don't know why, but whenever you would see your bathroom door during nighttime, you would be invaded by an overwhelming sensation of unease. You developed a habit out of locking your bathroom's door before going to sleep. You would never rest at ease until you closed and locked the door and whispered to yourself, "It's locked." You never understood your own fears, and as you grew up, though you still felt them, you began trying to overcome them, or at least ignore them as best as you could. Although the feeling lingers, you become bolder and bolder and feel as if you could forget all about this seemingly unreasonable childhood trauma. You then decide to stop locking the door. Rolling around in bed, you try to muster up the willpower necessary not to look or think about the unsettling door. With some struggle, you finally fall asleep. You suddenly wake up in the middle of the night. The first thing you realize that you're not in bed anymore. You lie on a hard and cold tile floor, surrounded by nothing but darkness and silence. You try to feel around yourself when your hand touches a bathtub, your bathtub. You freeze, your heart starts pacing while in panic you try to hear any sound, indicating the presence of anything else in that bathroom. You can't hear anything over the sound of your own panicked breath, and the thought that something could hear you breathing instead only deepens your despair. Being able to hold yourself together, you rush for the door as fast as you can. As you try to turn the handle, you realize your mistake. Your heart stops. It's locked. Suddenly, you hear someone else's breathing coming from behind your back. One day, when I was about 12, I woke up to a rough shove, assuming that my sister was waking me up. It was early morning, about 7:30. I groggily stepped out of the bed and was hit with hairspray fumes. I heard the sound of someone taking a shower, as well as loud, hurried footsteps and repetitive spritzes of the hairspray can. I walked to the dresser and pulled out a blouse and a skirt. As I got dressed, I heard knocking on my door. I pulled my top fully on and opened the door. There was no one there. I was kind of freaked out right now, but I knew that it must have been my imagination, as I was about half asleep at the time. I exited the bedroom. I heard the shower shut off as I passed the bathroom, then my father's heavy footsteps. At the end of the hall, there was another washroom. I heard repetitive spritzes coming from there and called to my mom, "Hey Mom, I need to pee and Dad's in the other bathroom." I heard my mother's voice, "Alrighty." It was definitely her voice, but alrighty was not something she had ever said. I rolled my eyes and walked away. I figured that I should wake up my granddad as I heard heavy snores coming from the room that he was sharing with my parents. I wondered why my parents hadn't woken him up. When I opened the door, I was scared to see that the room was empty. Just then, the noises and the smell of hairspray stopped. I ran downstairs and saw that my dad, mom, granddad, and sister were already eating breakfast. I checked my watch and saw that it was already 10 o'clock. My mom stared at me. What? I thought. My sister then said, "What the heck?" I asked them what was wrong. My sister then said, "You literally just went into the bathroom," and pointed to the bathroom that is next to the small kitchen area. I walked over there and pressed my ear to the door. Sure enough, someone was there, washing their hands. I shook it off and counted my fingers. 10 of them. I wasn't dreaming. I knocked on the door, and inside the bathroom I heard my own voice calling out, "Alrighty." I looked over at my parents, sister and granddad, who were all pale. Behind my back I heard the lock click, followed by my own voice saying, "Hey there, Sarah," and footsteps. I turned around just in time to see my own feet, dressed in my black velvet flats, turning the corner on the staircase. I felt paralyzed with fear and goosebumps crept up my back. I wasn't able to move for about a minute before I told my family all about what had happened a few moments ago. My sister told me that yesterday, when she woke up, I wasn't in my bed, but she heard noises coming from the bathroom. When she went there, she saw me walking down the hall in my pajamas and called out to me, but I kept walking. When she went back to my room, I was still sleeping in my bed. She freaked out and didn't tell anyone. Fast forward to 2 years later. My cousin now has a 6-month-old and we're talking to each other over tea. I told my cousin about what happened to me and my sister, and she froze. "That happened to you too?" she said. I felt the goosebumps return to my arms and legs. She then told me that she had woken up and walked downstairs when she saw her fiancé sitting at the table eating cereal. He greeted her, then said he was going to get something from upstairs. It took him some time. Eventually, she felt sort of concerned and went to check on him. He was asleep, still in his pajamas. It was the year 2000. Christopher was wrapping up his day at the office to return home to his wife and kids. It was his last day at work for the year. He was really excited to spend time with his family for the holidays. "Oh, crap," he said with a look of disappointment on his face as he walked outside to a snowing winter wonderland. "Damn it, it had to snow today. I forgot to put on my snow tires," he thought to himself while unlocking his car. Before he could start driving, he heard a voice yell his name. "Hey Chris, can I hitch a ride with you?" "Of course you can, Jim," he said, unlocking the passenger side door. I watched as they drove off into the darkness of the night. "Who am I, you ask? I'm unlike anyone else. That is enough information for you." They were driving towards Interstate 65, which is exactly what I dreaded. But alas, I couldn't do anything to stop them. Every day a lot of cars pass through the Interstate 65. There is a dark patch in the road, darker than your darkest fears, lined with trees on either side. This path looks beautiful during the day, but something lurks there at night. The canopy from the trees blocks out all the light from the stars and the moon. It is as if you're heading into a tunnel of trees. A lot of people enter this tree tunnel, but unlucky few never make it out. Chris and Jim arrived at this dreaded patch. It was covered with snow. I can see it, but I can't do anything about it. "Hey Chris, watch out," Jim yelled, but it was too late. Chris struggled with the steering wheel, but the car skidded off the wet road. There was a loud screech and a bang just as the car hit the side rail. Just like I remembered. None of them had sustained any major injury yet. The worst was yet to come. The night passed as the light from the sun lit up the tunnel. Their bodies were found not far away from the wrecked car. Their bodies were ripped apart and were disfigured beyond recognition. This wasn't the first time the police had seen such a sight on this road. Just like every time, the police report said that Chris and Jim got out of the car after the crash and tried finding help when they were mauled by some kind of wild animal, which they couldn't spot due to the darkness. To tackle this issue, they finally cut down the trees to improve visibility on the road, as if that would help. Only I knew what had happened. I had seen it coming, but I couldn't do anything, even if I wanted to. I watched expressionlessly as it ripped them apart, feasted on their flesh, and made its way back into the darkness. I had seen it ever since I was a kid. I tried telling people, but they all believe what they see or read, not something they hear from some kid or an acquaintance. After they cut those trees, the thing that lurked there is gone. It's gone somewhere else. Some other places with a dark patch, with more unsuspecting people to feast on. Where it will hunt again, just as it did here. It lives in the dark, waiting for unsuspecting victims. How do I know all this? I was the first victim. One night, a man had a nightmare. It was the most frightening thing he had ever experienced. In the dream, he found himself walking in a desert. Somehow, he had no idea how he had gotten there, but he knew he was lost and alone. When he looked down, he realized he was carrying a machete in his hand. The long, cold steel blade looked razor sharp. The sun was beating down and the heat was intense. The man was sweating profusely, but kept walking, even though he had no idea where he was going. After some time, he saw a dark figure crouching down in the distance. As he approached, he saw that it was a person, lying in the sand. He had been feeling extremely lonely, so he was grateful to see another human being. He quickly ran up to the man and bent over to help him up. However, when he turned the man over, he took one look at his face and recoiled in horror. He was looking at himself. In that instance, he was so overcome with fear that he raised the machete above his head and, without thinking, hacked the man to death. Horrified by what he had just done, he dropped the weapon and started running through the desert, trying to get away as far away from the place as possible. With every step, his feet sank further into the sand, but he kept going, driven by terror and panic. Eventually, he stumbled and fell to the ground. Lying on the sand, he realized that he had sprained his ankle. He couldn't walk another step. There was nothing he could do except lie there where he had fallen. After a while, he looked up and saw something in the distance. It was the figure of a man, approaching across the wide expanse of desert. As the man approached, he waited until he could see his face clearly. To his horror, he realized it was himself, and in his hand, he was carrying a razor-sharp machete. My old co-worker had a son that was in his mid-30s, and he had a son named Hunter that was 4 or 5. She said that Hunter would have bad dreams and that he would sleep with his dad when he got scared. One night his dad woke up because he heard Hunter calling him, but he was calling him by name, not Dad. So he went to his room and he was asleep. He woke him up and said, "Hunter, you were calling me. Is everything okay?" And Hunter said, "Dad, when they call you, you're not supposed to answer," and fell back asleep. He asked him about it in the morning, but he said he didn't remember saying it. I get chills when I think about it. To whom it may concern, if you're reading this, it is for a good reason, I promise you. You didn't stumble upon this by accident. This isn't just a cool story I thought you should read. And no, I'm not trying to sell you anything, nothing like that. Just know that it is for a goddamn good reason. Now I'm gonna preface this whole thing with a disclaimer. If this has reached you in error, if you've stumbled across this in error and this doesn't seem to apply to you, I'm sorry. I really am. I didn't mean to bring this on you, because once you're in, you're in. Once you know, this can't be undone. You're a little skeptical about the paranormal. You'll always say that you're a believer in it, but your mind is always trying to explain away whatever's happening to you, even if the experiences seem to speak for themselves. I'm not going to go into specifics of these experiences. You know what I'm talking about. This doubt is good. It's normal. It's the mind trying to keep you calm, keep you sane, and keep you living on as free from fear as possible. The mind is really good for that. The mind is really good for a lot of things. Remember that night you got into the car and it was raining? Do you remember that well? You'll know what I'm talking about. Think about getting into a specific car on a specific night and it was raining. One is going to stand out to you, one in particular. Focus on that one. Think about exactly who was in the car with you. Picturing it? Now think about the way the other car's headlights looked in the windshield. If you're having trouble picturing it, please don't read on any further. For your own well-being, you're not ready. If you're picturing it, think about when you reached your destination safely. It looks a little different, doesn't it? That's because this part is completely false. Try to remember the impact. Try to remember when the red Ford pickup collided with your vehicle. The flash of pain as your head smacked into the window and then nothing. Think very hard about that. Think back to that exact moment, because that's the most crucial. All of those experiences you had, think of them as being the nurses, doctors, and your family members visiting you in the hospice. That's where they've been. The real world leaking in. That's all they've been. Ghosts are a concept you invented yourself to keep yourself comfortable in this world. They're a self-made convention, and you need to give them up. Think really, really hard about this. As I said before, your reading this is no accident. That night was an accident. Everyone tries to get you to wake up every single day, but you won't. It's been months. They don't think you ever will. Go back to them, please. Wake up. They're begging you to wake up. If you're still reading this, I am really sorry. You're never going to wake up. Sincerely, you. I groggily opened my eyelids in an attempt to pull myself out of slumber. My eyes burned with exhaustion, as it was still the middle of what had been a long night. I reached for the glass of water sitting on my bedside table. My warm hand enveloped the condensation, and as I pulled the glass nearer to my face, it dripped. I made an attempt to sit up to avoid drenching myself in an ice-cold bath. I couldn't sit up. I couldn't move my torso. My throat was parched, and I grabbed it in desperation. As I stared at the glass, it taunted me. My throat tightened, becoming incredibly dry with every bead of water that rolled off the glass. The mental taunting continued and eventually changed to a whisper. I couldn't understand the voice. It mumbled incoherently in my ear. My arms were forced to my side, and the glass of water was flung to the wall. It shattered in a storm of shards and wetness all over the room. The shards fiercely pierced my skin. Hot, sticky blood began to spread over my body. The voice turned into many voices, and they wouldn't cease. I screamed out for help. I was so desperate. Only no sound came out. I felt sharp nails scrape the back of my throat, and the blood was filling my lungs. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't see. The whispers turned into shouts of rants. They gave me a feeling of loathing. I was gasping for one final breath, but I only inhaled blood. As I drifted away from life, the yells returned to a peaceful whisper, almost a sing-song voice. My lungs cleared and I felt them lighten. My throat opened up. I was no longer parched. My crusted eyes opened with ease, and I realized where I was now residing. I found myself stranded at the gates of hell. I never wanted to reveal my story, but it has to be done. It's been so long and nobody's known. But now I confide in you, the reader, to read my story, to listen, and to attempt to comprehend the horrors I experienced. My fingers stutter and shake as tears cascade down my cheeks as I try to type this. But I warn you now, what you are reading cannot be unread. It was just an ordinary night in my apartment. I was tired. The days at the office had just been so stressful lately, and I looked forward to the quiet release of sleep. It always seemed to make everything better. But this night was different. The wind seemed ominous. The sky seemed darker, and as I relaxed in my chair watching my favorite sitcoms before bed, I saw what appeared as a strange silhouette standing outside my window. I focused my full sight on what I thought was there. Nothing, just darkness. I figure I was just overtired, just a little too much work today, that's all. I finished watching my show and I retired to my bed. As I tried my best to sleep, I heard the door at the end of my bedroom creak. I dismissed it, too tired to get myself worked up over nothing. I then get the sense of something was watching me. I tried to shake it off. I just wanted to sleep. Finally, I heard something breathing heavily and slowly. At first, I thought it was me and that I was psyching myself out. So I held my breath for a moment. It wasn't me. I jolted upwards from my bed and opened my eyes. I became frozen as I saw at the foot of my bed a young girl with long black hair, around the age of 6, in a white nightgown. She stared at me with unblinking eyes and a wide smile. She had deep cuts covering her face, and her hands that hung at her sides were covered in crimson. We both sat and stood staring at each other for a good moment until she let out a horrifying, inhumane scream. At that moment I tried to race for the door, but she leapt on me, digging her nails into my face, her dark black eyes inches away from mine, screaming all the way. The screaming became deafening, and I soon lost my balance and hit my head on the table next to my bed. I lost consciousness. I awoke in what appeared to be an empty basement. My clothes remained on except for my shirt. I struggled to find my balance. My head was covered in dry blood. I looked at my arms. There were cuts all down them. Writing down words. I found the words read, "Will you play with me?" It was also written on both my sides. I gazed around the room in horror and found an iron door with blood seeping at the base. I slowly made my way there. There was no sign of the girl, though I feared she may be behind the door. Despite my fear, I had to go in. I had to. What I saw was horrifying. Bodies lay spread across the wide room, all the way to the stairwell on the opposite corner. Men, women, children, all of them laying still. cuts on their arms and legs similar to mine, and they all read, "Will you play with me?" Except these victims had something I didn't have. I looked at a nearby woman in horror. She laid on her back, her stomach split open. As I came closer, what came into my sight was a large toy fire truck, shoved in with her entrails. I choked back my vomit and backed away. A man laying against the wall had metal jacks stuck in both of his eyes. His skull had caved in, and what lay next to him was a broken baseball bat, snapped in half in a pool of blood. A young boy lay lifeless in the very middle. His mouth was wide open, and sticking out of it was the beginning of a toy car track. It had been shoved down his throat. His chest was cut open, and his heart lay next to his body. In place of his heart, there were the dismantled pieces of a doll. I lost my control and vomited. I cried for a moment, but then the thought struck me. Where's the girl? I didn't think this wanting to know where she was, of course. I thought it was very briefly before noticing the stairwell that stopped at the corner of the room. I started walking towards it, but then I stopped. Something behind me was breathing heavily. I turned around, and there stood the girl. After having stood in the corner and waited the entire time I was examining the bodies, she then said, in a high voice that pierced my ears with terror, "Will you play with me?" She began screaming. I turned to run away, but she was on me, knife-sharp nails driving into my back and neck. I struggled, and eventually I threw her off of me and onto the ground. I ran for the door, but it slammed shut. I banged on it and cursed, blood running down my back. It would not open. She was on me again. I elbowed her face. She drove her nails into my back. I managed to push her off and turn around. As she lunged, I caught her, her big black eyes inches away from mine. Her nails plunged into my face, her screams deafening my ears. She raised one hand, smiling ear to ear, and her hand plunged down on my eyes. Everything went black. I woke up in the hospital, bandages covering my body, including both of my eyes. A police officer stood in my room, speaking with a doctor. They saw I was awake and smiled. They informed me I was the only survivor of a mass murder, and that the suspect, a middle-aged man, had been captured. I told them about the girl. They said no girl was found at the scene. They didn't believe me. They told me I should rest. 2 weeks passed, and I was cleared to leave. As I exited the hospital, permanently scarred on my arms and back and face and sides, I passed the waiting room. It had some toys laying on the ground. The game jacks, a toy fire truck, a doll, and a toy car track. Sitting with these toys was a small girl with long black hair. She wore a white gown. She looked up at me and smiled widely, and in a voice that pierced every cut on my body, she said, "Will you play with me?" My old co-worker had a son that was in his mid-30s, and he had a son named Hunter that was 4 or 5. She said that Hunter would have bad dreams and that he would sleep with his dad when he got scared. One night his dad woke up because he heard Hunter calling him, but he was calling him by name, not Dad. So he went to his room and he was asleep. He woke him up and said, "Hunter, you were calling me. Is everything okay?" And Hunter said, "Dad, when they call you, you're not supposed to answer," and fell back asleep. He asked him about it in the morning, but he said he didn't remember saying it. I get chills when I think about it. It was the year 2000. Christopher was wrapping up his day at the office to return home to his wife and kids. It was his last day at work for the year. He was really excited to spend time with his family for the holidays. "Aw, crap," he said with a look of disappointment on his face as he walked outside to a snowing winter wonderland. "Damn it, it had to snow today. I forgot to put on my snow tires," he thought to himself while unlocking his car. Before he could start driving, he heard a voice yell his name. "Hey Chris, can I hitch a ride with you?" "Of course you can, Jim," he said, unlocking the passenger side door. I watched as they drove off into the darkness of the night. "Who am I, you ask? I'm unlike anyone else. That is enough information for you." They were driving towards Interstate 65, which is exactly what I dreaded. But alas, I couldn't do anything to stop them. Every day a lot of cars pass through the Interstate 65. There is a dark patch in the road, darker than your darkest fears. Lined with trees on either side, this path looks beautiful during the day, but something lurks there at night. The canopy from the trees blocks out all the light from the stars and the moon. It is as if you're heading into a tunnel of trees. A lot of people enter this tree tunnel, but unlucky few never make it out. Chris and Jim arrived at this dreaded patch. It was covered with snow. I can see it, but I can't do anything about it. "Hey Chris, watch out," Jim yelled, but it was too late. Chris struggled with the steering wheel, but the car skidded off the wet road. There was a loud screech and a bam just as the car hit the side rail. Just like I remembered. None of them had sustained any major injury yet. The worst was yet to come. The night passed as the light from the sun lit up the tunnel. Their bodies were found not far away from the wrecked car. Their bodies were ripped apart and were disfigured beyond recognition. This wasn't the first time the police had seen such a sight on this road. Just like every time, the police report said that Chris and Jim got out of the car after the crash and tried finding help when they were mauled by some kind of wild animal, which they couldn't spot due to the darkness. To tackle this issue, they finally cut down the trees to improve visibility on the road, as if that would help. Only I knew what had happened. I had seen it coming, but I couldn't do anything, even if I wanted to. I watched expressionlessly as it ripped them apart, feasted on their flesh, and made its way back into the darkness. I had seen it ever since I was a kid. I tried telling people, but they all believe what they see or read, not something they hear from some kid or an acquaintance. After they cut those trees, the thing that lurked there is gone. It's gone somewhere else. Some other places with a dark patch, with more unsuspecting people to feast on. Where it will hunt again, just as it did here. It lives in the dark, waiting for unsuspecting victims. How do I know all this? I was the first victim. There was a Catholic school that was rumored to be haunted. One day, a teenage girl stayed late after classes had ended to finish some schoolwork. As she was walking down the deserted hallway, she passed an open classroom. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught sight of a figure standing in the classroom. She walked back and peeked in the door. There was a nun standing there, scribbling on the blackboard. The nun suddenly turned to face her, and the girl gasped in fear. The old woman had no face. Her features were smooth like an egg. The teenage girl screamed and fled in horror. She had seen what was written on the blackboard. In scrawled, spidery handwriting were the words, "Help me, I am in hell." In a girls' school in the Philippines, it was the first day of the new semester. The girls were all in their classroom and getting used to their new desks. When the school bell rang, the teacher walked and introduced himself to the class. Then he started to do roll call, trying to make sure all of his students were present. When he had finished, he noticed that there was one girl whose name hadn't been called. The girl was dressed in a white shirt and jeans and was sitting in the front row, directly across from his desk. He asked the girl if she was in the wrong classroom. She didn't answer and just stared at him with a blank face. He repeated his question and she remained motionless. Suddenly, he noticed that the girl was bleeding from her forehead. The entire class screamed as the girl stood up, walked right past the teacher, and disappeared straight through the blackboard. A woman kept having reoccurring dreams in which a masked man was trying to kill her. The mask was very distinctive. It was spiked at the top with no eye holes, and it had a large zipper across the mouth. The mask was made of leather, and one night she had another nightmare. In the dream, she looked out her bedroom window and saw the masked man walking up her garden path and towards her front door. She awoke from the nightmare, trembling with fear. Suddenly, she heard the doorbell ring. She grabbed her nightgown and ran downstairs. Cautiously, she opened the front door. There was nobody there. She looked down and saw the leather mask lying on the doorstep. A college student decided to visit one of his friends. He was excited because he hadn't seen his friend in a while. When he got to his friend's house, he found the young man laying in bed, hiding beneath the covers. They talked for a while, and the student found his friend's behavior very strange. After a while, he stood up to leave, and his friend suddenly said, "You can't go." His voice was urgent, and his face was dead serious. "Why not?" asked the student. "She won't let you leave," replied his friend in a fearful voice. "She?" asked the student, looking around the room curiously. "Who's she?" He couldn't see anybody else in the room. "If you go, she will follow you and kill you," said his friend. The student stared at his friend incredibly. He saw his friend glance towards the chest of drawers in the corner of the room. He followed his friend's eyes, looking at the chest of drawers, and a chill ran down his spine. There, in the shadows of the narrow 5-centimeter gap between the wall and the dresser, he saw a paper-thin woman staring back at him. In her hand, she was clutching an ice pick. This happened in one of the elementary schools in Japan. It was 8 p.m. and time to close up the school. One teacher who worked long hours in the staff room packed his bags and left. He was about to lock the gate when he saw a group of dark figures in the distance. They were on the football field. It looked as though it was a group of boys kicking a ball back and forth. "Hey, what are you doing there?" shouted the teacher. "Come on, it's time to go home. I have to lock up." The boys continued playing and paid no attention to him. "Don't pretend you can't hear me," shouted the teacher angrily. "The school is closed. Quickly now, go out the gate." Just then, one of the figures kicked the football high into the air. It landed on the grass and came rolling over to the teacher. When it stopped at his feet, he looked down, and the blood suddenly drained from his face. He was overcome with horror. It wasn't a football, it was a boy's severed head. There was a 20-year-old girl who lived with her boyfriend. Their life together was a perfect idyll, and they both hoped that nothing would happen to change it. Each time they embraced, she told her boyfriend that she could not live without him. He assured her that he felt the same way. They were madly in love. One Saturday night, as every Saturday night, they went out to a nightclub to celebrate the birthday of a friend. While they were there, they drank way too much alcohol. They returned home very late and eager to get to bed. They took a shortcut and drove at high speed. The next morning, when they both woke up, they felt that something about their relationship had changed. Their mutual understanding was somehow different. They no longer spoke, no longer touched, no longer kissed. In short, they almost completely ignored each other. That evening, they both found themselves watching TV together. The news came on, and there was a story about a fatal car accident that happened the night before. The newscaster said that one of the victims had died and one had survived. When the pictures of the two victims flashed up on the screen, the girl and her boyfriend were horrified. They were staring at their own faces. The most terrifying thing was that there was one question that remained unanswered. Which one of them was the ghost? One night, not so long ago, I was walking home with a friend of mine. We both lived in the same apartment building. It was a dark autumn night, and the rain was pelting down. All of a sudden, there was a loud roar, and we heard a car swerve on the road. We were caught in the glare of a bright yellow, and a car plowed into us. We were tossed head over heels into the ditch. My friend and I were covered in mud. The driver had never even bothered to stop. We helped each other out of the ditch, and by the light of our phones, we started checking each other for injuries. We seemed to have escaped without even a bruise. We cursed the driver for being so careless and continued walking. When we reached our apartment building, we stopped to smoke a cigarette outside. When we finished smoking, I told my friend I was going home to bed. He said, "You go ahead, I'll wait here for a while." I woke up in a hospital bed. My body was covered in bandages and plaster. I was dizzy, disorientated, and nauseous. Puzzled, I asked the nurse, "Where am I? What happened to me?" "You're in the hospital," the nurse replied. "You just woke up from a 3-day coma. You were hit by a car, but you miraculously survived. The police found you lying on the road." "What about my friend?" I asked. I'm sorry," she replied. "Unfortunately, he didn't make it." When I got over the shock, I recalled the last words my friend said to me when we were saying goodbye at the entrance to our building. "You go ahead, I'll wait here for a while." There was a young girl named Alicia who moved with her parents to a new town. They rented a big old house that was sparsely furnished. Alicia slept in the downstairs bedroom while her parents slept upstairs. After they had been living there for a few weeks, Alicia's parents noticed that she was growing very thin. As the days went on, her health seemed to get worse and worse. Then, the poor girl came down with a mysterious illness and was confined to her bed. The doctor came to examine her, and when he told her parents that she was suffering from anemia, all she needed was some rest, he said, and soon she would be as good as new. However, despite what the doctor said, Alicia's condition continued to get worse and worse. Her skin was gray and pallid. Her cheeks were sunken and there were dark circles around her eyes. Her parents were distraught and had no idea what to do. While Alicia slept in her bed, her mother and father paced back and forth restlessly, wondering what could be the cause of her mysterious illness. Day by day and hour by hour, the poor girl grew worse and worse. She was so weak she could barely move. Alicia was fading fast and the life was ebbing from her veins. She was deathly pale and her body was shriveled and withered. She started to have hallucinations and began screaming out in terror and babbling incoherently in a weak voice. Finally, Alicia lost consciousness and passed away. Her parents were inconsolable. They held a funeral service and buried their beloved daughter in the town cemetery. The day after the funeral, Alicia's mother was stripping the sheets off her daughter's bed when she noticed something on the pillow. There were 2 red stains in the white material. When she picked up the pillow, she noticed it was unusually heavy, so she called her husband to come and take a look at it. As the parents examined the pillow closely, the mother suddenly let out a scream. She felt something moving inside it. The father fetched a knife and slit open the pillow, emptying the feathers out on the floor. As the parents watched in horror, something crawled out of the pile of feathers, slowly moving its hairy legs. It was a monstrous black spider, so swollen with blood that they could scarcely make out its mouth. Night after night, as Alicia lay in bed, this hairy abomination had been stealthily sucking out all the blood from her body, slowly draining her life away. On a dark night, a 15-year-old girl named Lydia was walking home from her friend's house. She turned down a narrow street to take a shortcut and was startled by the sight of an old man standing in her path. When she stopped, the old man turned to her and in a hoarse voice said, "Tell me the way." His face was disgusting, his skin covered in scars and boils, his hair stringy and unkempt, his eyes bulging horribly, almost popping out of their sockets. Lydia was terrified. She was alone in a dark and narrow alleyway with a strange and disturbing person. Her heart began pounding and took her a few seconds to catch her breath. "Tell me the way," the old man demanded. Okay, where are you going?" asked Lydia nervously. When the old man told her the address he was searching for, a chill ran down her spine. It was her house. "I don't know where that is," she replied, as she pushed past the old man and ran down the alleyway. Glancing back, she could see him standing in the alley, watching her flee. Lydia was so freaked out by the incident that she didn't stop running until she got back to her house. Breathing a sigh of relief, she took out her keys. She looked up and down the street to make sure the old man hadn't followed her. It was empty. She turned the key, unlocked the door, and pushed it open. From the darkness inside her house, a hoarse voice said, "Tell me the way." Suddenly, you hear the front door creak open. Whew, you can finally get some sleep. You call out to your mom, hoping she'd lock the door so you don't have to go downstairs. She doesn't respond, but it's nothing too unusual. Her hearing's been a bit dodgy recently, probably due to her new boss. She shuffles into the kitchen, and you return your gaze back to the screen of your laptop. True, you need to sleep as soon as possible, but there were a few things to do first. As you refresh your newsfeed for the 10th time, you spot something on the screen. No, not on the screen, reflected onto it. Something in the window behind you. You whip around, but there isn't anything out there in the darkness. It's probably nothing, just a bug or whatever. You turn back to Facebook and pick up the latest on some giant argument between some popular kids. You refresh to keep up with the stream of new comments, when all of a sudden you lose connection. Dumb fucking router. It always cuts out on you at random moments. You make a mental note to remind your mom, who's fiddling around in the kitchen still, to buy a new one. You get up, walk out of your room, and thump down the stairs. Disgruntled, you walk into the living room and crouch down next to the main computer to restart the router. Strange, the lights on it are all off, as if it's been unplugged. Whatever. As you go to turn on the router, the phone on the desk begins to ring. You stand up, narrowly missing the edge of the table to pick it up. Hey sweetie, I'm so sorry, the train's been late again. Ugh. I'll be home in a bit. I'm sorry I'm making you wait up for me, it's just that. And the line goes dead. Like every other parent, mine had always wanted to take pictures of precious moments. Most of them consist of me with food on my face and other cliches. I recently found a box of these photos. They were all old Polaroids. I still have the camera that was used to take them. I took a stack of the pictures out of the box and started looking through them. About halfway through the stack, I noticed something. A small black smudge. I thought it was just something on the lens, but it seemed to appear in every photo, and gradually got bigger as I grew older, within all the pictures. I had finished that stack and decided to move on to the next. And there it was again, that same black spot in the corner. I quickly flipped through them, my eyes barely glazing over the picture before changing to the next. I had gone through about 8 years worth of photos when I started to see something in the black spot. Outlines of something that was barely visible. I looked closely at each photograph, trying to find out what it was. Like always, as I progressed, it got closer and closer. I gasped as I looked at one picture. What I initially thought was just a smudge had turned into a face. It was slightly transparent. It had 2 large pits for eyes. A big, wide, toothy, evil-looking grin. It was so close, much closer than it had ever been. The mask was hovering behind my smiling 12-year-old self. I dropped the picture back into the box. That was the last picture I'd ever taken. It had been 13 years since that picture. I closed my eyes, breathed out, then got up and put the box away. I walked back to my room and steered clear of mirrors and any other reflective surfaces. I sat at my desk and opened up my desk drawer. I looked down and saw it, the camera that had taken all those pictures. I grabbed it and held it in front of me, facing me. I took a deep breath. 1, 2, 3. Click. The picture slid up from the slit and started developing. I took it out and set it on the desk. I waited and waited. The picture slowly coming into view. I got up from the desk and walked over to my bed, grabbing my book and slowly making my way to the desk. I set the book down gently and closed my eyes. I patted around for the picture. Once found, I picked it up and held it in front of my face. I quickly opened my eyes and screamed. I didn't see me. I saw nothing of mine. All I saw was that face. A mother and daughter were traveling together in Europe. When they arrived in Paris, they booked into a luxury hotel. The mother was feeling quite poorly and decided to go to bed early. The daughter was a little worried and sent for the hotel doctor, who examined the mother and wrote out a prescription. The daughter then set out into the city to find a pharmacy and buy the medication for her mom. What should have been a simple errand ended up taking the daughter almost 4 hours, mainly because she spoke little or no French. She searched the entire city and eventually managed to find a pharmacy that was still open. Finally, the frustrated daughter arrived back at the hotel with the medicine, only to discover that her mother's room was completely empty. It was as if her mother had just vanished into thin air. In fact, the hotel room looked completely different. The carpet, the wallpaper, and the curtains all had different patterns. The bed was made and it looked as if it had never been slept in. All of their luggage was nowhere to be found. When the confused daughter stopped a cleaning lady in the corridor and asked where her mother was, she was met with a blank stare. In fact, all of the hotel staff denied ever seeing the mother and daughter before. The hotel manager even said he had no record of them ever checking into the hotel. At this point, the daughter became frantic, and she fled to the embassy where she was greeted by sympathetic officials who wouldn't believe her story. Instead, they doubted that her mother even existed and decided that the daughter must be crazy. Trapped in a nightmare, the young girl ended up being sent to a mental hospital, where she died years later, completely insane. One night, a teenage girl went to a nightclub with her friends. They had a great time, drinking and dancing, and it was 3 a.m. by the time they left. Her friends lived in the city, but the girl lived in the suburbs. They said goodbye and went back to their apartment, leaving the girl to make her own way home. Unable to get a taxi, the teenage girl decided to walk home on her own. On the way, she had to cross through a park. It was very dark and all she could hear was the clacking of her heels echoing in the night. She thought she saw something moving in the bushes, so she quickened her pace. Suddenly, a man appeared from behind a bush and blocked her path. His face was hideous. It looked terribly scarred and misshapen. She tried to run, but he cornered her and grabbed hold of her arms. The frightened girl pleaded for her life and tearfully asked to be let go. The man's deformed mouth twisted into a leering grin. "Do you want death or smiley face?" he asked. "Please, just let me go," she cried. "Death or smiley face?" he insisted. The girl didn't know what he meant. "Smiley face," she replied. Without a word, he pulled out a knife and sliced the corners of the girl's mouth up to her ears. Her face was left completely deformed. She was scarred for life. Whenever people saw her in public, they said she resembled a grotesque smiley face. Do you ever get that nagging feeling that you've forgotten something? You know that feeling when you've left something behind, but you can't remember what it was. It was just after 6 when I left the office and walked to the bus stop. As I stood there waiting for the bus to arrive, I had a strange sense of unease. I felt as if I had left something important behind, but I couldn't think of what it was. Maybe it's nothing, I tried to assure myself, but something was nagging at me. I felt like going back to check, but I was too tired. I just wanted to get home. When the bus came, I piled in with the other passengers. As usual, all the seats were taken. I clung to the handrail as the bus lurched back and forth. I bumped into the man behind me and said, "I'm sorry," but he just looked away. More and more, I felt that I had left something important at the office. The farther the bus carried me from the office, the more certain I became of it. I went over the day in my mind. I thought about my creepy boss staring at me all day. I thought about the other secretaries gossiping about how he had a crush on me. I thought about the letters he told me to post. Had I forgotten them? Of course not. I thought about the meetings I had to schedule. Had I scheduled them? Of course I did. I racked my brain for some clue as to what I had forgotten. I told myself that I would feel better when I got home. The uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. I got off the bus at my usual stop, but when I came to the lane that led to my house, I finally gave in. It's no use, I thought. This will be nagging at me all night. I have to go back to the office and see what it was that I overlooked. As tired as I was, I made my way back to the bus stop, back to the office. I was just doing this to put my mind at ease. As I got off the bus, I heard the clock strike 7. I walked quickly up the side street to the office and turned the key in the door. Quickly, I ran up the stairs. When I opened the office door, I suddenly stopped in my tracks. To my horror, I recognized what it was I had left behind. It was me. My body was laying strangled on the floor. You have probably heard the phrase, if you die in your dreams, you die in real life. I have always been skeptical of this phrase. I never thought that this phrase was logical. How does a figment of your imagination cause your mortal self to die? I kept believing that a dream was a dream, and nothing in your dreams actually happened unless it was some sort of flashback. But that all changed when I decided to create my own sleep experiment. Because of that experiment, I now believe that it's possible to lose your life from a terrifying experience in your dream. Do you want to know my story? Go ahead, listen on. But you might regret knowing of my experience. I have always had a scientific mind. I analyzed everything and thought of other possibilities before I came to a conclusion. Thus, I was an honor roll student. Straight A's in all of my classes except gym. Boy, how I hated physical activity. Anyways, because of my highly inquisitive scientific mind, I have always been a skeptic of many theories and superstitions. No matter how much proof there is to back up a theory, I know that eventually there will be a factor that completely destroys that theory. You could say I'm a little crazy because Isaac Newton's law of motion are extremely accurate, but that's just how I see the world. So now you know why I don't believe how the phrase, if you die in your dreams, you die in real life, could possibly be logical. But of course, my scientific mind decided to test it. For 1 week, I decided to do nothing but watch horror films and read Creepypasta to trigger paranoia and cause nightmares. Hopefully, I would trigger a nightmare that causes me to die and eventually wake up, thus disproving that superstition. And so this experiment began. Sunday, June 3rd, 2012. So today I spent over 10 hours watching classic horror films and reading Creepypasta. I have to admit the stories were quite unnerving, but I didn't find them that scary. However, before I went to sleep that night, I couldn't help but think that there was someone out there looking for me. I finally settled down and went to sleep. I woke up in a dark room that reeked of human decay. I was tied to a wooden slab and I realized I could not even struggle. That's when I saw a shadowy figure in the corner of the room. "Don't even bother struggling," the figure said, with a voice that sounded raspy and crazed. "I injected you with a serum that causes temporary paralysis." At this point, I was panicking. I kept trying to struggle even though I knew it wasn't possible because I was temporarily paralyzed. I kept trying and trying and trying, but it was no use. I was immobilized. That's when the figure turned towards me. He slowly moved forward and pulls out a knife, possibly getting ready to gut me alive. That's when I saw his face. I woke up. Unfortunately, I woke up before I could be killed in my nightmare. But I will never forget that nightmare. It was so lucid. It was almost like it was real. It felt too real. And that face was just so frightening. The figure had the eyes of a demon. They seemed to stare directly into your soul. His skin wasn't pale, like most psychotic murderers, but it was more blackened. It appeared as if his face was smeared with blackened makeup. But of course, it was all a dream, right? That thing couldn't possibly be real. At least that's what I thought. Monday, June 4th, 2012. I spent another 10 hours watching horror films and reading Creepypasta. All of it seemed very far-fetched, especially Slender Man, who I knew could not possibly exist, and slasher films tend to over-exaggerate the psychopathic tendencies of murderers. However, that same feeling of paranoia continued to course through my veins. I still managed to settle down. This time, it was many years into the future. It was proven that there is life on other planets, and their technology was millions of years ahead of human technology. They decided to invade. Humanity was desperate. We ran frantically, hoping to gain shelter from the oncoming alien invasion. I kept hearing laser rifles being blasted everywhere, and I also kept hearing a droning sound, possibly the sounds coming from the extraterrestrials' vessels. To humanity's dismay, we were not safe. They had found us and captured every one of us. I blacked out and woke up in what appeared to be a science laboratory. I saw many people being experimented on by the extraterrestrial beings. That's when I saw a bright white light. I woke up too early once again. So far, this experiment seems to be failing. I could never stay asleep to the point where whatever was coming at me would eventually kill me. Since this experiment lasted a week, and I considered how lazy some people are when reading long stories, I've decided to cut out some of my journals and skip ahead to the final night of the experiment. After all, I don't want you to think that I would want to read a week's worth of journals. That just would be way too much. Saturday, June 9th, 2012. It's the final day of my experiment. I have spent 60 hours of my life watching horror films. Time to go for another 10. This time, however, I never felt that unnerving this time. Since I began doing this experiment, I've gradually become less and less freaked out by horror films and creepypasta. So, falling asleep was easy this time. It was a bright summer day. I was hanging out with a bunch of friends, mainly playing games and talking about our lives. That night we decided to dare each other into performing dastardly stunts. One of us jumped out of a third-story window. Another prank called the vice principal of our school. When it was my turn, they decided to dare me to run through the local cemetery and back, and repeat this action 3 more times. So I ran through once, twice, 3 times, and that's when I blacked out. I woke up in the same dark room as one of the first nightmares. I was tied to that same wooden slab. The room still reeked of human decay. It didn't look much different from before. I also realized that I was able to move. Well, hypothetically, because I was practically immobilized by being tied up to the wooden slab. So I began to struggle. My actions caught the attention of the same figure, who was standing next to what appeared to be a small laboratory. He turned towards me, staring me down with those same unnatural demonic red eyes. "You woke up," he said, still using that crazed, raspy voice. "Too bad, I haven't figured out or finished the serum yet." I panicked. He was going to inject me with that same paralysis serum, thus suppressing my ability to struggle. I couldn't believe myself. I was still struggling to get free, even though I knew it was of no use. But I guess it's human nature to want to be free. That's when I felt a shock. He violently injected the needle into my neck. I screamed in agony as the syringe pierced my spine, allowing the serum to flow freely and disable my nervous system, completely immobilizing me. Now, where were we? He told himself, grabbing his cart of surgical tools. The last thing I heard was a demonic chuckle and the words, "Sweet dreams." Then I felt an extreme shock of pain through my chest as he stabbed me. I woke up. I was celebrating to myself because the experiment was successful. I managed to disprove the superstition that dying in your dreams make you die in real life. At least that's what I thought. I felt a brief shock of pain through my chest. Then I noticed the rope burns around my wrist and ankles. I also felt serious pain on the back of my neck. But I never realized the vividness of my dream until I took a look at my chest, and right there was a giant scar, right above the location of the human heart. As you're eating dinner or watching reruns on TV, they're watching. As you sit at your computer late at night, they're watching. When you walk from your bedroom to the bathroom late at night, you can be certain that they're watching. They watch everything you do. They listen to every little sound you make. They're with you every second of the day and every day of the year. Who are they, you may ask? Well, it's not so much a question of who they are, but what they are. For the lack of a better name, I simply call them watchers. Everybody has one, and you've likely already seen yours countless times. It's in the room with you right this second. Take a quick glance all around you. Chances are your eyes connected with the eyes of your watcher. Oh, but don't bother looking again. They can't be seen by normal people. We're programmed not to take any notice of them. They could be anywhere though, hiding behind chairs in your dining room, watching you from atop your refrigerator, staring at you from underneath your desk as you do work, peeping at you from the end of your bed as you sleep. Some people are chosen, however, chosen to be the few unfortunate bunch that gets to see their watcher. I am one of these unlucky few. They're never fully exposed, but the sight of one is sight to pity. They're almost always hunched over in a fetal position, their small, pale, bony body looking as if it would be crushed under the weight of its large head. They have large, black, soulless eyes that are always staring right into yours, always watching you, judging you. It starts slow, being able to see them. In the course of a few weeks, you'll begin to see small movements in your peripheral vision. You will throw these occurrences off as normal, well, until the noises begin. The noises gradually get more and more defined over 2 or 3 weeks. In my experience, it was the slow padding of feet shuffling across my hardwood floor as I was trying to sleep. Then I began to hear it graze the shower curtains as I shampooed my hair. Finally, I could hear it whispering to me when I was alone in a language I had never heard before. For weeks, I thought that I was crazy. For weeks, I considered checking myself into a mental hospital. For weeks, I felt like killing myself. That is, until I finally saw it. It was about 1.5 years ago, and I was reading Robert Stevenson's novel Treasure Island. As usual, I heard the slow patter on the floor coming from the furthest corner of my room to the end of my bed. Annoyed, I looked up, expecting the usual nothingness that I was used to seeing for the past months. When I looked up, it was the same sight I was used to seeing. There was, however, something about this sight that made me feel uneasy. Finally, I noticed it staring at me from between the bars at the end of my bed. I could just see the outline of its head in the dark of night. I quickly looked back at my book, acting as if I hadn't seen it, in hopes that it would just go away. I sat there paralyzed for what seemed like half an hour before I looked up again. It was still there, staring at me, looking at me, watching me. You've likely had this same experience. The difference is that you didn't notice it watching you. You're not supposed to notice it. It doesn't want to be noticed. After a few days, I began seeing it everywhere, looking up at me from under the table while I ate dinner, in passing cars on my way to work. My watcher appeared everywhere. I scream at it to go away, but it just stares at me. I throw things at it, but it doesn't move. My girlfriend and friends all left me because they thought I was acting psychotic. My family keeps telling me they can't help me, but I don't need help. I just need to stare back, and it'll go away. I rarely move anymore. I figure that if I bore it, it'll finally leave. I'll just have to sit here and watch it. I'm always watching it. The first day of school is always nerve-wracking for any student. My first day at a new school was an absolute nightmare. I was 14 years old and my family had just moved to a new town. Moved home. My dad had been offered a job with better pay, and in a mere week we had sold our house and rented an apartment in the town we moved to. It was during the summer we moved, so it was simple starting at my new school. On the first day I walked alone to the school. I was nervous about having to make new friends. When I arrived, I picked up a timetable and saw that my first class was mathematics. It was in room 104. I began walking down the hallway searching for the room, but the school was like a maze. Eventually the bell rang and the students made their way to their classrooms. In less than a minute the corridors were deserted. I stopped in front of a pair of old-looking wooden double doors. I pushed, and with a scraping sound of metal on wood, they opened. I found myself in a corridor that was old and dusty. The lockers were all hanging open, and the stench of mold and damp hung in the air. I was about to turn around and go back the way I came when I noticed the numbers on the classroom doors. 100, 101, 102. I began walking down the hallway, but when I peered through the windows of each classroom, they were empty. Then I came to room 104. I peeked through the window. All of the students were sitting at their desks. The teacher was standing at the blackboard and class was in session. I quietly opened the door and went inside. None of the other students paid any attention to me. I started to apologize awkwardly for being late, but the teacher just turned her back on me and began writing on the board. Turning red from embarrassment, I hurried and found a free seat at the front of the class and sat down. The teacher had already written her name in chalk on the blackboard. It was Mrs. Taylor. I was nervous and self-conscious, so I didn't want to draw attention to myself. Throughout the class, I just kept my head down and concentrated on solving the math problems. Eventually, after what seemed like hours, the bell rang and the class ended. The other students scrambled out of their desks and ran out the door. I looked at my watch and was shocked to see that it was already 3 p.m. The school day was over, and I had only attended one class. I walked down the corridors trying to find the exit. All of a sudden, I heard someone calling my name and I looked around. There was a teacher making his way towards me and he had a frown on his face. You, yes, you. You're the new boy, aren't you? He said. Yes, I replied. Where have you been? He demanded. I've been searching for you all day. Why didn't you go to your classes? But I was in class, I protested. Which class? He demanded. Mrs. Taylor's class, I replied. Room 104. The teacher's eye grew wide and he flew into a rage. I suppose you think you're pretty funny now, don't you? He shouted. Well, you're not. It's no laughing matter. Now get out of my sight. I was very confused, and on the long walk home I kept wondering what I had said that got him so upset. As soon as I reached my house, I turned on my laptop and went online. I started searching for the name of the school and the teacher, Mrs. Taylor. What I found scared me to my very soul. There were old news articles about a terrible massacre that happened in the school 10 years before. One morning, bright and early, a crazed gunman had simply walked into the school and started shooting. He stood at the doorway of a classroom and shot the teacher. Then he picked off the students one by one until every single person in the class was laying dead in a pool of blood. There were pictures of the classroom where the murders happened. I recognized it immediately. It was room 104. There were also photos of the victims. I recognized them too. Trembling with fear, I gazed at the smiling faces of Mrs. Taylor and the students I had been in class with. I felt sick to my stomach. My hands were shaking and a chill ran through me. I spent all night trying to convince myself that it wasn't true. The next morning, I was too terrified to go back to school. I broke down and told my parents what had happened. At first, they thought it was just nerves, but eventually, after I refused to go to school for a whole week, they gave in and enrolled me in a different school. I managed to get on with my life and tried my best to forget all about the incident. I almost succeeded. This morning, I received a letter in the mail. There was no stamp on the envelope and no return address. It had been hand-delivered. When I opened it and read the printed card inside, my hand started shaking again. It was an invitation to a class reunion, and it was signed from Mrs. Taylor. For most of my life, I've had a strange recurring dream. It started when I was only 8 or 9 years old, and I still have the dream today. It's always the same, but some details are different every time. In the dream, I find myself in a large, dark house, walking up a long set of stairs. The walls are all white and the carpet is pitch black. There is a clock on the wall and I can see that it's close to midnight. The whole house seems to be deserted and everything is deathly silent. At the top of the stairs, I walk through a massive mahogany door and find myself in a huge, dimly lit room. The room is full of people sitting in rows. Their chairs are all facing a stage. There is a person on the stage sitting in a red leather armchair, and the audience are watching intently. The person on the stage seems to be speaking in a low voice, but from where I'm standing, I can't hear what they are saying. Each time I have the dream, there is a different person on the stage. There are never enough chairs for everyone in the audience, and those who come late, like me, have to stand up in the back. Sometimes a vacant chair appears near the front. It's always a mystery how this happens because no one ever seems to leave. Whenever the vacant chair appears, the people standing at the back argue over who should take it. "You go ahead," says one. "Oh no, that's all right," says another. "You have it." They often insist that I take the vacant chair, but something has always told me not to do it. "Aren't you going to sit down?" they ask. I always shake my head and let someone else have the vacant chair. One night I recognized the person on the platform. It was a man who I knew very well. The next morning I called him at work and his secretary answered. I told her I wanted to make an appointment to meet the man. I'm afraid you can't, she replied. He passed away. His wife found him dead in his bed this morning. Not long after that, I had the dream again, and I saw another man on the stage who I knew. It was my next-door neighbor. He seemed to recognize me too because he nodded at me. The next morning I called around to his house, but when I knocked on the door, there was no answer. I banged and banged on the door, but there was no sign of life. After a while, I became worried and called the police. When they came and broke the door down, they found my neighbor dead in his bed. He died in his sleep of a sudden heart attack, they said. I don't know if it was just a coincidence that I dreamed about these two unfortunate people, and they happened to die in exactly the same way, but now, every time I dream the dream, and I notice a vacant chair, I always let someone else sit down instead of me. There was a boy named Matthew who was 14 years old. It was his father's birthday and he wanted to buy him something nice. Unfortunately, he didn't have very much money, so he decided to go to a flea market. Browsing through the stalls and car boot sales, he spotted a camera. He remembered that his father always wanted one, so he picked it up and took a look at it. The camera was a bit old and there were scratches and scuff marks on the outside, but when he looked through the viewfinder, everything was clear. Even though it was second-hand, it seemed to be in good condition. To see if it worked, he took a picture of a large mirror that was propped up against a nearby table. He asked the seller how much he wanted for it. The price was a lot cheaper than he expected, so he immediately handed over the cash and bought it. As he was leaving, the seller mentioned that the camera had once belonged to 4 college students who had mysteriously disappeared. When he heard this, Matthew was a little unnerved. All of a sudden, he heard the sound of breaking glass. When he spun around, he saw the mirror he had taken a picture of had just fallen over and shattered into tiny pieces. That evening, Matthew, his mother, and his little brother waited anxiously for his father to come home from work. As soon as he opened the front door, they shouted, "Happy birthday!" and started giving him their gifts. The camera was exactly what his father had wanted. He went out to the garden to test out the camera and took a picture of a tree and the family dog. A few hours later, the tree withered and died. The family dog ran out in front of a car and was killed. Saddened by these events, Matthew sat alone in the garden and examined up the camera. He discovered that there were other photos saved in the memory. He found pictures that the 4 students had taken of themselves before the disappearance. That was when he finally figured it out. The camera was cursed. He had to tell his parents. He dropped the camera on the grass and ran inside the house. "Dad, Dad, the camera's cursed," he cried. "Whatever it takes a picture of gets destroyed or dies." They raced out to the garden again, and Matthew was horrified to see his little brother playing with the camera. Quickly, he ran over and snatched it out of the little boy's hands. "Did you take any pictures?" Matthew demanded. "Yeah, why?" his brother replied. Matthew's heart sank. "What did you take a picture of?" he asked. "I took a picture of the sun," said his brother. "Cool, right?" Just then, it started to grow very dark. It's early in the morning. The sun won't be up for another couple hours. You're fast asleep in bed, lost in a dream, when the phone rings. Rather than waking up, you roll over and cover your head with a pillow. Hours pass. The sun rises. The phone is ringing. When you wake up, your alarm clock is blaring and the phone is ringing. By the time you will yourself to turn the alarm off, the phone has stopped ringing. You realize that it's been ringing all morning. You slide out of bed and press the blinking red button on your phone as you stumble into the bathroom. The phone beeps, followed by the friendly electronic voice. Hello, you have 666 new messages. Message 1. The phone beeps again, and you're not prepared for what comes next. Screaming. You spin around thinking that she's standing right behind you. There's pure terror in her screams, accompanied by other disturbing noises. You stand there, horrified, for about 10 seconds. Screaming gives way to hysterical, garbled crying, before dying out with the sounds of spilling meat and tearing flesh. The phone beeps again. You're shaking. He was dead. That much was clear. She looked from the still body lying on the road to the dented hood of her BMW in panic. She'd gotten out of trouble before, but nothing on this scale. This didn't seem like something she could just make go away. She contemplated the broken form in front of her. He seemed homeless, ancient tattered clothing, grizzled features. Hell, even for a corpse he looked sickly. There was a drainage ditch by the side of the road. Well, odds were good that no one would miss him. It didn't take much force to nudge his emaciated form in. Her ill-gotten relief was cut short, however, as a hand closed around her throat. A harsh voice whispered in her ear, "Just so you know, I only eat the ones who try to leave. Would have let you go if you tried to help." In one swift movement, he snapped her neck. "We're both monsters," he hissed. "I'm just more honest about it." I woke up to a beautiful morning. The sun was shining and it shimmered on the water. All of a sudden, something caught my eye. It was a little girl. She was waving her arms and moving her legs back and forth. She needs help, I thought. She can't breathe. I reached out and grabbed her, pulling her close to me. I tried to calm her down. "Everything's going to be fine," I told her. "I saved you. Breathe in. Just relax and breathe in." Despite all my efforts, she went limp. I held her tightly. Not again, I thought. What went wrong this time? Children are so difficult to understand. Maybe my tentacles scare them. I brought her down to the bottom and buried her under the silt. Then I took a deep breath of water and went back to sleep. She was standing in front of the mirror, brushing her hair when she noticed something. She stopped brushing. Something wasn't right. I blinked. She didn't. It was a tiny mistake, but she noticed. Her hairbrush slipped from her hand. So did mine. Her eyes grew wide in fear. So did mine. Her hand crept closer to the mirror. So did mine. Our fingertips touched the cold glass. All of a sudden, I reached out and grabbed her wrist. I took her by surprise. She struggled, but she was no match for me. I yanked as hard as I could and pulled her through the mirror. Then I jumped out and took her place. I stared at her, beating her fists against the glass. It was no use. She didn't know how to free herself. I watched her silently screaming, begging for help. Then I picked up a chair and smashed the glass, trapping her forever. You know when you're falling asleep and you suddenly get the feeling that you've tripped? Your body lurches forward in an instant, ready to protect you instinctively from injury. You can almost see the ground rising to meet you. This occurs when the boundaries between you and the you in an alternate universe are weakest. This is the feeling that happens when another you dies. I love how my grandfather is always around to keep me company. On days that my mom isn't around, Grandpa is always nearby to comfort me. I sit on his lap and tell him stories about my day, and I never feel like I'm alone. Although our house is never empty, even when Mom leaves for work, and I sit with Grandpa and read stories while he enjoys his chair. We always have guests in every room of our house. There's Edna and Elma, the twins my grandfather is friends with. They're always sitting together in the kitchen with a teapot between just the two of them. There is also Joseph the plumber, who went to school with Dad, often seated with him in his study as Dad is hunched over his desk with a grin on his face, always looking at their high school yearbook, while Joseph keeps him company, as old friends should. Unless Mom needs to use a spare chair, then Joseph just stands next to Dad as he looks at his yearbook. Then we have our younger guests like Beth and Thomas, who are around my age, often upstairs when they aren't playing with me. However, I don't really care if Thomas stays up there with his mom and dad. He never talks to me, and always makes a stupid face at me when I try to play with him. But Beth is really nice. She has a pretty blonde curls in her hair. She wears pretty perfumes and makeup, and sometimes Mom buys new dresses for her to wear. I'm sure she likes those because she always has a smile on her face. Even when I accidentally asked Mom how she got the ugly scar on her back. I felt bad when Mom told me that she had gotten the scar when she came here and was separated from her parents, who Mom says were very bad people. So I guess that makes her like the sister I never had. But I just like playing games with her when I'm bored. But Mom often scolds me if I get Beth's dresses dirty or accidentally knock her down. Tonight my mom says we'll be having another guest and a new friend for me to play with. Hopefully his family can come too. But Mom says that it's hard to get an entire family like Thomas's to come and stay in our home. So before she leaves for work, she tells me she'll be home by midnight. She gives me a kiss on the cheek, packs up her tools, and tells me to go make some space in Beth's room for the new boy to stay. It's the last time I talk to Mom before she leaves for work, and I go upstairs to get the bedroom ready. It takes me a while, and by the time I'm done, I don't want to play with Beth like I usually do. So I grab a storybook from Beth's shelf and go downstairs to the living room. As always, Grandpa is there, sitting in his rocking chair, waiting for me to come and sit in his lap and tell him how my day went. So I climb up into his lap and snuggle against him as I tell him about our new guest. But I notice something's wrong. His head is limp to one side and his eyes are closed. So I hop off his lap and go into the kitchen as fast as I can. I run past Edna and Elma and immediately go for the bottom drawer next to the silverware where we keep Grandfather's emergency supplies. I go back into the living room, stopping at the doorway to remember my manners and say, "Good evening," to Edna and Elma before I go back to Grandpa. Carrying the supplies in my arms, I drop them behind Grandpa's chair and look up at his neck. "Grandpa, your stitches came out again. It'll take me forever to fix your neck like last time. If only Mom had sewn you shut with a machine and used beads to stuff you like she did Beth, instead of that flimsy cotton. Then you wouldn't be falling apart all the time. But I'm not upset with him. It's not his fault. Mommy was only learning when she first brought him over as a guest. We'd only just moved into the neighborhood, and she wanted to make sure that we'd never have to be lonely ever again. But of course now our guests can sit straight and never fall over, and Mom says that someday she'll be sitting next to Grandfather while I'm out bringing new guests to keep us company. The doorbell rings and you get up from where you sat staring stonily into space. You already know who was at your door and why he is there. You open it, nodding numbly to the man. You make a note in your head that the man looks sneaky, but you assume that must be because he's a lawyer. You show him into your living room, dreading what is to come. The man hands you a CD he produces from his briefcase and sets what looks like a birdcage on your coffee table. You cannot see what's inside the cage as it's covered by a blanket of embroidered silk. The man sits as you put the disc into your stereo and press play. You hear the sound of a stressed breathing from the speakers as you take your seat. The lawyer hasn't said a word, but you know the breathing to be that of your late friend. The last breaths of your friend. You can hear something in the background, behind your friend's heavy breaths, as if someone or something was scratching at a door. You wonder if you're hearing things, as the sound is barely audible in the recording. You look up as you hear her voice, as she was in the room with you, as if she was alive. The date is September the 1st, 2008. Her voice is shaky. Every word she speaks is saturated with fear. This is my last will and testament. Now, I don't have much time. They're almost here. So I'll dispense the formalities and get on with what I have to say. This is the last day of my life, as you've probably already figured out. This began with the death of my uncle. I had never known him very well, only a few times at family reunions and Christmas parties. But he had left me something on his will. I sat awkwardly through the reading of a document until at last my name was called. I collected a small box of knickknacks and a covered cage. On the cage was a note saying, "Please do not unveil the surprise until you are home." So I hurried home without taking the silk blanket off the cage. What was inside the box is of no coincidence. But underneath the blanket, I warn you, do not take the blanket off until this recording is ended. It is an old bird cage. Inside of this bird cage is a parrot. I was indeed surprised, but there were more shocks to come. When I lifted the blanket, the bird's eyes were immediately fixed on me. Its beady eyes shone wickedly upon seeing a new face, and it said plainly in a squawky voice, "Hello." I stared back at it, and it repeated itself, "Hello." I dismissed it as a cute trick my uncle had taught it. I was very wrong. The next day when I took the blanket off the cage, I was not greeted with a hello. No, on the second day the bird didn't talk at all. What it did do was breathe loudly, as if it was hyperventilating, or at least copying someone who was terrified. On the third day the bird did not speak, but made the sound of a grown man crying. I was very disturbed and covered the cage for the remainder of the day. The fourth day, in a voice not unlike my recently departed uncle's, the bird cried, "Oh God, oh God." I thought the bird had learned it from listening to the television, and I resolved to never let it hear the television again. I didn't turn on the TV all day, but on the fifth day when I uncovered the cage, the bird screamed. Not a normal scream, mind you, and it was nothing I'd ever turned on. The television. It was the sound of a man screaming in terror and pain. It was, I know now, the scream of my uncle that he gave when he was killed. When the bird screams again, it'll be my scream as they tear me apart. For even now the bird is listening to me. It stares at me coldly where I barricaded myself in the kitchen. As your life depends on it, do not uncover the cage. The sixth day, yesterday, when I hesitantly uncovered the cage, the bird was quiet. Perhaps 10 minutes later it cocked its head to the side, as if it had heard something I could not. "They're coming," it whispered. "They're coming." Over and over again he repeated in a haunting voice, "They're coming." Today is the 7th day and they are here. Just as the bird said, I can hear them scratching at the door and crawling in the walls. The bird is waiting to record how I die. I swear, if it could grin, it would have been grinning from the moment I uncovered its cage. The noises are getting louder. They'll get in soon, so I'm saying goodbye now. Take care of the bird. I couldn't think of anyone else to give it to. I'm sorry. You must take care of him till they come for you. You have 7 days. The track ended suddenly and you look around. Startled, you must have been entranced by the disc, for the lawyer was gone. You hadn't noticed him leave. You stare at the covered cage on the coffee table and wonder if you had just heard on the CD was real, or just some elaborate hoax. A rustling comes from underneath the embroidered silk. Your curiosity begs you to see what's in the cage. You slowly raise up the blanket and you hear, "Hello?" The images we see in the mirror are the pure incarnates of evil. They are only allowed to exist in the area reflected in the glass. To them, life is like a never-ending hell, rotting away in the same room day after day. The only refuge from this purgatory is death, and the only way for them to die, sad to say, is if you die. Fortunately, they are bound by a code. You are their master, and they must mirror your every movement and expression. To do otherwise would break an unbreakable law, unraveling the space-time continuum. However, there is a loophole, and it can only be triggered by you, the master. To force them into error is to free them from their contract. After you let them out of your view, you're on your own. Know this, when you watch them, they're watching you back. They're waiting, and they're thinking. It's 3 a.m. and you've been up all night on a horror binge. You've watched your favorite horror movies, read your favorite scary stories, and even attempted the old Bloody Mary trick in your mirror. You stretch and yawn, deciding now is about the time to hit the hay, so you move it into your bedroom and lay down to sleep. After a while, however, you realize that you can't get the images of some of the fictional creatures you saw on TV out of your head. Man, I'm gonna hate myself for this in the morning, you say aloud as you flick on your bedroom lamp, knowing that having a nightlight used to help get rid of your nightmares as a little kid. Within minutes, you're close to sleep, snuggled up comfortably under the blankets with your eyes closed and more pleasant thoughts on your mind. That is, until you detect something moving in front of the light, casting a shadow over you. You blink, beginning to turn towards the lamp before a rotting hand grabs hold of your shoulder. Thanks for turning on the light. I wouldn't have been able to find you in that darkness. Deep beneath the New Mexican desert, there is a lost city in a dark cavern. Many have journeyed to the deep city. Some have returned, some have not, completely vanished without a trace. As for what happened to the builders of the city, no one knows for sure. What I do know is that I have walked the rubble-strewn streets and have heard the cries in the dark, inhumane shrieks. I have no clue what these creatures that make these sounds are. I've been told that pictograms in the cavern suggest they were slaves to the builders, but I like to say no one knows. Eventually, the random cries in the dark began to take a toll on me, and I fled the cavern, returned home, and until this day, only told a few close friends of what I'd seen and heard. Now, as I walk down the darkened streets of my own hometown, I've begun to hear the creatures again. They are calling me back to the cavern. The time is coming. A strange ringtone plays on your cell phone. You reach for it, but whoever it was must have hung up. A wrong number, maybe. You look at the phone anyway. You've missed a call. You listen to it. When you put the phone to your ear, suddenly you hear a scream of pain. You toss the cell across the room, but you can still hear it. When you finally pick the phone up, you see who the call was from. You realize whose voice it was. It was yours. In some television markets, people get two different versions of the same channel. This is usually caused by affiliates being nearby. For example, while living in New Jersey, receiving the ABC affiliate from both New York City and Philadelphia, or living in Southern California and getting both the Los Angeles and San Diego stations. For the most part, these appear to be the same channel in all, except local news and some daytime programming, with the exception that one is actually closer and more clear than the other. These channels, in reality, should not occur. Television markets are set up to focus around one city, and offering two different versions of the same channel in one market can split viewership in the ever-competitive ratings race. If you are to watch the channel with the worst reception from the city that is further away, you'll start to notice that the news reports major events that never occurred, on people that aren't real, on technology that shouldn't exist. The ads are for products that you've never heard of. The conspiracy theorists think that these television stations belong to an alternate world. They point to the fact that the news tends to be getting worse over there, more separate from our own. They are reporting of looking into an alternate world and invading it for their own. Just pray they aren't talking about us. There is a chance that while on a railway journey across country, you will pass a darkened station. The platform will look as if it's been deserted for years. The train will have to slow down due to the condition of the tracks, but it will not stop. There are some conductors who will go much faster than they should just to get past the station, causing the train to feel as if it will shake apart. If you ask one of the personnel on the train about the station, they will tell you not to worry about it and go back to your seat. If you ask a second time, you and all your things will be unceremoniously dumped at the next station, whether it's your destination or not. There you can wait for as much as a day for another train to come by. There have been a few curious folks who have made the 5-mile-long walk down along the side of the tracks to see this abandoned station for themselves. No one knows what happens when they get there. Some are never seen or heard from again, and others jump onto the tracks in the path of the next oncoming train. The only thing of any interest ever to happen along those tracks was back in the early 1900s, when a train headed west derailed near that abandoned station, killing 61 people on board and injuring others. The incident was blamed on conductor error and on the fact that the rails were misaligned due to shifting of the ground after a heavy rainstorm. There is no known connection between the derailment over 100 years ago and the events that surround the area today. The hum is what people have called a phenomenon that occurs in some places in the world. It is a low-frequency humming noise that sounds not unlike a distant running engine. However, the source can never be found. Even with microphones and all sorts of audio technology, the source has yet to be found. The most popular location to hear the hum is in New Mexico. Only some can hear it as well as feel it. They can hear it throughout the day and into the night. The hum does not stop. It has never stopped. Many people hear the hum only, or much more, inside buildings as compared with outdoors. Many hum sufferers can also perceive vibrations that can only be felt through the body. Earplugs are reported as not decreasing the hum. The hum is often perceived more intensely during the night. Common coincidences include a lack of sleep, as the hum can keep some sufferers awake or wake them in the middle of the night. During the last decade, the hum phenomenon has been reported in many other cities and regions in North America and Europe, and in some other regions of the world. What will happen when the hum reaches you? Will you hear it at night when you don't expect it? Maybe it's already there. There's a mailbox somewhere in the city which can solve your problems. Which city? That depends on who you ask. There may even be more than one. Who knows? Anyway, this mailbox isn't emptied anymore. The mail service has completely forgotten about it. But it clings on. It's located in some relatively unlikely place, so you won't spot it immediately. Mail you put inside it won't go anywhere. But the box is special. Write a letter about your most pressing problems to the persons in charge of dealing with it. Write to your significant other, your boss, the IRS, and get it all off your chest. Ride yourself into deep shit with that letter. You'll see that the problem will dissolve soon, in some way you hadn't thought likely. The snag, of course, is that you really can't be sure whether you have found the right mailbox until you try it. And if you haven't, things are going to get much worse once your letter gets delivered. There has always been a theory dashing around humans that there is life outside of our planet. That theory is technically correct, but not in the traditional sense. There is indeed life outside our planet, a single life, a single alien, a very lonely one. All it wants is a few friends, but sadly, it's too far for your technology to travel at this time. It's constantly surrounded by the corpses of its creators, the creator before that, and so on. You see, the way this species works is it births a single offspring with a single parent. The parent then dies, leaving the offspring to live on its own, to live its own life. It has to walk through its world knowing its reason its creator is dead. It's reason that there's another one of those lifeless shells spread across its planet. I inform you of this not because it's dangerous, because it's endangered. You human freaks need to speed up your technology and save it before the monsters reach it. Those that threaten this poor alien are ones that can be easily stopped. If you have a Model 9 AGS 9021 compact laser rifle, but you shouldn't have those for a few hundred years. So that is to say, they're nearly unstoppable at this time. But you can find it on the alien's planet. It doesn't know it, but it holds one of the strongest weapons of all time in its tiny infant hands. If you can reach it in time, it'll kindly give it to you. If not, the monsters will surely have ripped it from the alien's cold dead hands, driving the species to extinction. The species used to have millions to be one of those most feared races in the universe. The monsters, different from these, wiped them out. Now, as I said earlier, the alien shouldn't be feared, but what you should be afraid of is the fact that the home planet for these monsters is Earth. And I'm pretty sure that was their shuttle they just sent off, not yours. Sometimes I can hear it pacing around my bed. It's kinda in a hurried motion, as if he had more than 2 feet, which he doesn't. I know because sometimes I catch a glimpse of him. He looks a bit anorexic, if he's even human. For all I know, he could have been buff for his kind, if there is any more of his kind. God, I hope not. His mouth is wider than anything I've ever seen. I think he either broke his jaw or has no jaw. Another thing that doesn't help the fact that his large, gaping hole of a mouth is accompanied by 2 beady eyes with black skin surrounding them. Another thing that I know is that he is blind. I once met his eyes, but he turned as if I wasn't there. I try to meet his eyes a lot, but I get no response. What makes up for his loss of eyesight is his sensitive hearing. Once my cat jumped off the couch and the beast heard it from my room. He bolted out of my room and then silence. The next day my cat was found dead in the backyard, and they all thought a coyote or stray dog had killed it. I could only make out a huge human-like bite mark under its torso. He had killed it. He had to have. I have never seen anything that could make a bite so large. All I could say is that a coyote could not have possibly created such a huge bite. Tonight was different, though. I had to sneeze, and I did, but the pillow muffled it. I didn't think he noticed. He just turned and scratched my closet door. At least that's what I thought he was doing. After a while, it seemed that he was writing something. To my amazement, he was. I started freaking out once I lost sight of him in the darkness. The only thing that calmed me was the complete silence. My pupils dilated and I can see in the dark. I saw in the corner where he once creeped too, and he wasn't there. Then I heard at the foot of my bed a growl, like an angry dog's growl. My heart sunk deep into my chest and my heart rate must have slowed down a lot. Even after this, I dare not move. As it crawled slowly closer to my face, I read its message carved into my closet door. I heard you. My daughter finds it hard to fall asleep at bedtime. More often than not, she's up until 10. I suppose that wouldn't be so bad, but she's only 4 and she should be sleeping much more. But it never really bothered me. I stay up rather late as well, and with her near me, I have someone else to talk to. Sometimes we have wild discussions about aliens, horses of all kinds, Some with wings, some with horns, and the kind of horses all little girls dream about. But tonight we were talking about monsters. This struck me as a little odd because she never wanted to talk about anything scary, and the kind of monsters she was talking about were rather frightening to me. For whatever reason, she thought up this monster with jagged teeth to rip into flesh. It had scales like a fish, slimy and tough, like the armor of an armadillo, but that wasn't the scariest part. That honor was given to what it would do to its prey. The monster will stalk you for a while, perhaps even get you to trust it, then attack. When I asked my daughter how this happens, she couldn't think of an answer. Maybe because she was still young and couldn't think of how to manipulate people that well yet. But regardless, I was happy she couldn't think of one. She had fallen asleep at 10:15, which was lucky for me because she started to freak me out with all that monster talk. I picked her up and carried her off to bed. My eyes widened when I was about to lay her down. She was already in her bed. I looked down at the child I was carrying. Its eyes were open and black. If you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. If you'd like to, you can follow me at Twitter. The handle is @FuzzyPantaloons, and I'll see you all next time.